Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the vast and storied lands of the American frontier. Tonight, we'll explore the complete world of Red Dead Redemption, from the legendary tales of Red Harlow to the final chapters of John Marston's story. This is a chronicle of outlaws and lawmen, of changing times and fading legends, of honor found in unlikely places and the price of civilization's march westward. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we ride together through these dusty trails and forgotten stories. There's no rush here, no need to remember every detail. Just let these tales wash over you like evening mist across the plains. In the beginning, there was Red Harlow, a figure whose very name has become synonymous with the untamed spirit of the American West. Long before the Vanderlinde gang rode through the heartlands, before John Marston drew his final breath defending his family's honor, there existed a gunslinger whose exploits transcended the boundaries between history and legend, between truth and the stories men tell around campfires when the night grows long and the whiskey flows freely. Red Dead Revolver, that first chronicle of frontier justice and bloody vengeance, introduced us to a world where the line between hero and outlaw was drawn not in ink, but in gunpowder and lead. Red Harlow himself emerged from tragedy as these frontier legends so often do, his childhood shattered by violence, his path toward manhood carved through landscapes of dust and death. Yet there was something different about Red, something that separated him from the countless other souls who sought their fortunes at the barrel of a gun. The story of Red Harlow begins in the goldfields of California, where men's dreams of easy wealth collided with the harsh realities of frontier life. His father, Nate Harlow, was a prospector like so many others, a man who believed that somewhere beneath the earth lay enough precious metal to transform a hard-scrabble existence into something approaching comfort. But the frontier was never kind to dreamers, and the gold that glittered in mountain streams often came with a price paid in blood. When Red was still a boy, his world was torn apart by Colonel Darren and his associates, men who represented the darker side of frontier capitalism, where might made right and violence was simply another tool of business. The massacre that claimed Red's parents was not an act of random brutality, but a calculated elimination of witnesses to crimes that would have scandalized even the lawless territories of the 1850s. In that moment of terrible loss, young Red Harlow ceased to be a child and became something else entirely. A living weapon forged in the crucible of grief and tempered by an unquenchable thirst for justice. But what makes Red Harlow's tale so compelling is not merely the familiar pattern of vengeance that drove him forward across the years that followed. It is the way his story has grown and changed in the telling, how the facts of his existence have become embellished with each retelling until the man himself has become less important than the myth he represents. In the world of Red Dead Redemption, Red Harlow exists as both historical figure and legendary archetype, a gunslinger whose exploits are whispered in saloons, from New Austin to New Hanover. The older residents of towns like Armadillo and Strawberry still speak of Red Harlow in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of stories passed down through generations of frontier folk. To some, he was a hero who cleaned up the territories when law enforcement was little more than a joke told by men with badges but no backbone. To others, he was simply another killer in a land already drowning in blood, no better than the criminals he hunted despite the righteous fury that drove him forward. This ambiguity, this blending of historical fact with mythological embellishment, represents one of the most fascinating aspects of how the American frontier created its own pantheon of legendary figures. Red Harlow's story demonstrates how the harsh realities of frontier life gave birth to tales that transcended their humble origins, becoming something approaching modern folklore. In an age before mass communication, before newspapers reached every settlement and photographs captured every significant moment. Stories were the primary means by which communities made sense of their world and their place within it. The weapons Red carried became as legendary as the man himself, artifacts imbued with supernatural significance by those who chose to believe in such things. His twin revolvers, one inherited from his father, and bearing the distinctive scorpion engraving that would become his calling card, were said to never miss their intended target, to fire true, even in the hands of a man pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Whether such claims held any basis in reality mattered less than the comfort they provided to those who needed to believe that justice, however rough and ready, could still triumph in a world that often seemed to reward only the strong and the ruthless. As years passed and Red Harlow's active career came to its inevitable conclusion, his story began to intersect with other legendary figures of the frontier. Landon Ricketts, that consummate professional gunslinger whose skills were acknowledged even by those who despised everything else about him, claimed to have known Red personally during their younger days. Whether this association was genuine or merely a product of Ricketts' tendency towards self-aggrandizement remains a matter of historical debate, but the connection serves to link Red Harlow's legend with the more documented exploits of later frontier figures. Ricketts himself represents a fascinating bridge between the mythical world of Red Harlow and the more historically grounded narratives that would follow. Unlike Red, whose story exists primarily in the realm of legend and second-hand accounts, Landon Ricketts left behind a trail of documented encounters, newspaper reports, and verified incidents that allow historians to separate fact from fiction with somewhat greater confidence. Yet even Ricketts' story is colored by the myth-making tendencies of frontier culture, his genuine skills as a marksman, and his legitimate reputation as a formidable opponent, magnified by repetition until he too became something larger than life. The relationship between these legendary figures and the communities they moved through reveals much about the psychological needs that frontier society sought to fulfill through its storytelling traditions. In a world where death could arrive without warning, and justice was often nothing more than the will of whoever happened to be strongest or fastest on any given day, the existence of figures like Red Harlow provided a comforting illusion of moral order. These were men who fought not for personal gain but for abstract principles, who used their exceptional skills in service of causes greater than themselves. Yet the frontier was never quite so simple as the legends would have us believe. For every Red Harlow who channeled his exceptional abilities towards some approximation of justice, there were dozens of lesser men who used similar skills purely for personal advancement, who killed not out of moral conviction but from greed, hatred, or simple bloodlust. The very same qualities that made Red Harlow a legendary hero could just as easily have made him a notorious villain, had his circumstances been slightly different, had his moral compass been oriented toward different poles. This moral ambiguity extends even to Red's methods, which often involved the same brutal tactics employed by his enemies. The frontier demanded a certain ruthlessness from those who wished to survive, and even the most righteous of gunfighters found themselves walking perilously close to the line that separated justice from vengeance, heroism from murder. Red Harlow's legend survives partly because history has chosen to emphasize the righteousness of his cause, while glossing over the more troubling aspects of his methodology. The influence of Red Harlow's legend extends far beyond his own immediate story, rippling outward through the decades to shape how subsequent generations of frontier figures understood their own roles and responsibilities. The Van der Linde gang, despite their criminal activities, often justified their actions by appealing to the same codes of honor and justice that supposedly motivated legendary figures like Red Harlow. Dutch van der Linde himself was fond of quoting the supposed wisdom of frontier heroes, using their examples to rationalize everything from bank robbery to murder. Even as the frontier era drew to its close and the wild territories gave way to organized civilization, the legend of Red Harlow continued to evolve and adapt to changing times. Parents told sanitized versions of his story to their children, emphasizing the triumph of good over evil while carefully omitting the more graphic details of his methods. Writers and journalists crafted increasingly elaborate accounts of his exploits, each new telling adding fresh embellishments until the historical Red Harlow, if he had ever truly existed, became buried beneath layers of fictional enhancement. The persistence of Red Harlow's legend speaks to something fundamental about the American experience of the frontier, something that transcends the specific details of his individual story. In Red Harlow, frontier society created an idealized version of itself, a figure who embodied all the virtues that communities hoped to possess, while remaining unburdened by the moral compromises that daily survival demanded from ordinary people. He represents the dream of what the frontier could have been if it had lived up to its highest aspirations, rather than succumbing to its basest instincts. As we move forward through the chronicles of Red Dead Redemption, we carry with us the knowledge that every story we encounter exists within the shadow of Red Harlow's legend. The moral questions that would plague Arthur Morgan and John Marston, the tensions between individual freedom and social responsibility that would define their struggles, all echo themes first established in the mythical adventures of that first legendary gunslinger. In Red Harlow's story, we see both the promise and the peril of the American frontier, the heights of heroism it could inspire, and the depths of violence it could demand from those who sought to tame it. Before the storm that would shatter their world and scatter their fellowship to the four winds, there existed a golden age of the Van der Linde gang, a time when Dutch van der Linde's vision of freedom seemed not just possible but inevitable, when the bonds between unlikely companions felt strong enough to weather any adversity the changing world might bring against them. This was an era measured not in months or years, but in the quality of trust shared around campfires, in the unspoken understanding that passed between men and women who had chosen to live outside society's constraints while somehow managing to create their own version of family among the outcasts and the dispossessed. The formation of what would become the Van der Linde gang did not happen overnight, nor did it emerge from any single moment of dramatic decision. Rather, it grew organically from the meeting of two fundamentally different yet complementary spirits, Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews, whose partnership would become the philosophical and practical foundation upon which everything else would be built. Their first encounter, sometime in the 1870s, represented the convergence of idealism and pragmatism, of grand vision and careful planning, of passionate rhetoric and patient wisdom. Dutch van der Linde arrived in the world carrying within himself a contradiction that would define not only his own destiny, but the fate of everyone who chose to follow him. Born into comfortable circumstances that should have guaranteed him a place in respectable society, he possessed both the education and the natural advantages necessary for conventional success. Yet something in his nature rebelled against the structured predictability of legitimate life, against the compromises and moral flexibility that seemed required for advancement within established social hierarchies. From his earliest years, Dutch demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to see through the comfortable lies that civilized society told itself, to perceive the violence and exploitation that lurked beneath polite conventions and legal frameworks. Where others saw progress and opportunity in the westward expansion of American civilization, Dutch saw the systematic destruction of indigenous peoples and the concentration of wealth in the hands of those already powerful. Where others celebrated the coming of the railroads and the telegraph, Dutch recognized the instruments by which distant capital would extract resources from local communities, leaving behind only poverty and environmental devastation. This clarity of vision, combined with Dutch's remarkable gifts as an orator and his genuinely magnetic personality, might have made him a formidable advocate for social reform had he chosen to work within existing institutions. But Dutch's nature demanded more immediate and dramatic solutions than could be achieved through political processes or gradual cultural change. He saw himself not as a reformer but as a revolutionary, not as someone who would petition for justice but as someone who would seize it directly from those who had monopolized it for their own benefit. The philosophy that Dutch developed during these formative years was simultaneously sophisticated and naive, combining genuine insights about social inequality with romantic notions about the possibility of living completely outside the systems he criticized. He envisioned a community of free individuals who would support themselves through their own skills and mutual cooperation, who would take what they needed from a society that had taken everything from them, who would create their own moral framework based on loyalty, courage, and authentic human connection, rather than arbitrary legal codes designed to protect the property of the wealthy. Into this world of grand ideas and passionate convictions came Hosea Matthews, a man whose life experiences had taught him both the necessity and the limitations of Dutch's idealistic vision. Where Dutch saw the world in terms of abstract principles and sweeping moral narratives, Hosea understood the practical realities of survival on society's margins, the day-to-day challenges that faced anyone who chose to live outside conventional structures of employment and respectability. Hosea had learned through hard experience that good intentions and noble goals meant nothing without careful planning. Without understanding human nature in all its complexity, without recognizing that even the most justified criminal activities carried consequences that extended far beyond their immediate participants, he brought to his partnership with Dutch not cynicism but wisdom, not opposition to the younger man's ideals but a mature understanding of what those ideals would require in practical terms. The genius of their partnership lay not in their similarities but in how their differences complemented each other, creating a leadership structure that could inspire loyalty while maintaining the flexibility necessary for survival in an increasingly hostile environment. Dutch provided the vision and the rhetoric that gave meaning to their criminal activities, transforming simple robbery into acts of social justice and elevating their gang from mere outlaws to something approaching a revolutionary cell. Hosea provided the practical knowledge and careful planning that kept them alive, that turned Dutch's grand gestures into sustainable patterns of behavior. Together, they began to attract others who were drawn either by Dutch's charismatic vision or by the practical security that Hosea's careful leadership provided. These early recruits came from all walks of life, united not by common background or shared circumstances, but by a combination of desperation and hope, by the sense that conventional society had failed them and that Dutch's alternative offered something better than mere survival. Arthur Morgan arrived as a boy, orphaned and alone, carrying within himself the potential for both great loyalty and terrible violence that would define his role within the gang for the next 20 years. Even as a child, Arthur displayed the combination of physical courage and moral sensitivity that made him invaluable to Dutch and Hosea, capable of the ruthless actions that outlaw life sometimes demanded, while retaining enough conscience to question the morality of those actions. Dutch saw in young Arthur something that reminded him of his own younger self, a capacity for righteous anger at the world's injustices combined with the physical capability to act on that anger. But where Dutch's anger had been refined by education and philosophical reflection into abstract principles, Arthur's remained visceral and immediate, rooted in personal experience rather than theoretical understanding. This made Arthur both more reliable and more dangerous than Dutch himself, more likely to follow orders without question, but also more prone to the kind of explosive violence that could destroy carefully laid plans. Hosea's influence on Arthur was equally important, but manifested in subtler ways, teaching the boy not just the practical skills of survival, but the emotional discipline necessary to function within a group of strong-willed individuals. Under Hosea's guidance, Arthur learned to channel his natural aggression constructively, to think strategically rather than reactively, to understand that true strength often lay in restraint rather than in the immediate application of force. The arrival of John Marston several years later added a different dynamic to the gang's internal relationships, introducing both potential conflict and eventual balance. Where Arthur had found in Dutch and Hosea the father figures his orphaned childhood had lacked, John came to them already shaped by experiences that had taught him to be suspicious of authority and resistant to the kind of absolute loyalty that Dutch demanded from his followers. John's natural rebelliousness, combined with his youth and inexperience, made him a challenging addition to the gang's carefully maintained harmony. He possessed many of the same qualities that made Arthur valuable, the same capacity for violence and the same fundamental decency, but he lacked Arthur's instinctive deference to Dutch's leadership and Hosea's wisdom. This created tensions that would simmer beneath the surface for years, occasionally erupting into open conflict, but more often manifesting in subtle competitions for status and recognition within the gang's informal hierarchy. Dutch's relationship with John was complicated by the younger man's resistance to the philosophical framework that gave meaning to their criminal activities. Where Arthur accepted Dutch's explanations about social justice and necessary rebellion, John remained focused on more immediate concerns, more interested in the practical benefits of gang membership than in its supposed moral significance. This made John both more and less reliable than Arthur, less likely to be swayed by Dutch's rhetoric, but also less committed to the gang's long-term survival when it conflicted with his personal interests. The addition of other members during these golden years created a complex social ecosystem that somehow managed to function despite the potentially explosive combination of strong personalities, criminal activities, and the constant stress of life outside the law. Each new recruit brought their own skills, their own needs, and their own potential for both contribution and disruption to the gang's delicate internal balance. Susan Grimshaw emerged as the practical manager of daily life within the gang, the person who ensured that meals were prepared, camps were maintained, and the dozens of small tasks necessary for group survival were completed efficiently. Her authority was different from but complementary to the leadership provided by Dutch and Hosea, focused on the immediate needs of daily existence rather than long-term strategy or philosophical justification. The women of the gang occupied a unique position within this masculine world of violence and criminal enterprise, neither fully protected from its dangers nor completely integrated into its power structures. They were expected to contribute to the gang's survival through both domestic labor and, when necessary, direct participation in criminal activities, yet they were also excluded from the decision-making processes that determined the gang's direction and priorities. This contradiction created its own tensions and opportunities, as women like Susan Grimshaw and later additions like Abigail Roberts and Molly O'Shea navigated between traditional gender roles and the more fluid expectations of outlaw life. They found ways to exercise influence and authority within the constraints of their circumstances, becoming essential to the gang's emotional and practical functioning, while remaining vulnerable to the whims of men whose loyalty could shift with changing circumstances. The gang's relationship with money during these golden years reflected Dutch's complicated attitude toward wealth and material possessions. On one hand, Dutch genuinely believed in his rhetoric about taking from the rich and giving to the poor, about using criminal activities as a form of wealth redistribution that challenged the fundamental inequities of American capitalism. On the other hand, the gang's own survival required accumulating and maintaining reserves of cash and valuable goods that could support them during lean periods or emergency relocations. This created an ongoing tension between Dutch's idealistic vision and the practical realities of outlaw life, between the desire to live according to higher moral principles and the need to secure resources for survival. The gang developed elaborate justifications for their accumulation of wealth, telling themselves that they were simply preparing for the day when they could purchase their freedom from criminal life, when they could buy enough land and legitimacy to live according to their ideals without fear of legal retribution. The Blackwater money, that legendary score that would supposedly solve all their problems and allow them to realize Dutch's utopian vision, became both symbol and practical goal during these years of planning and preparation. Dutch spoke of it not just as a means to financial security, but as the key to their ultimate liberation, the resource that would allow them to establish their own community, somewhere beyond the reach of civilization's corrupting influence. Yet even as they planned for this ultimate score, the gang's daily activities created their own momentum and meaning, establishing patterns of behavior and relationship that became valuable in themselves. The morning coffee around the campfire, the evening conversations about philosophy and current events, the shared meals and communal decision-making all contributed to a sense of genuine community that transcended their criminal activities. Dutch's leadership during these years was characterized by a combination of intellectual stimulation and emotional warmth that made gang members feel not just protected but valued, not just employed, but genuinely cared for as individuals. He remembered personal details about each member's background and interests, asked thoughtful questions about their concerns and aspirations, and made each person feel that their contribution to the gang's success was both noticed and appreciated. This personal attention was not mere manipulation, though it certainly served Dutch's interests as a leader, but reflected a genuine capacity for human connection that made his eventual transformation all the more tragic. During these golden years, Dutch's care for his followers was authentic and generous, creating bonds of loyalty that would endure long after the circumstances that created them had disappeared. Hosea's contribution to gang morale was different but equally important, providing a steady presence that balanced Dutch's occasional flights of romantic fancy with practical wisdom and emotional stability. Where Dutch inspired through vision and rhetoric, Hosea led through example and quiet competence, demonstrating daily the values of patience, careful planning, and genuine concern for others' welfare. The relationship between Dutch and Hosea during these years represented one of the most successful partnerships in the annals of American criminal history, combining complementary strengths while minimizing individual weaknesses through mutual support and shared responsibility. Their friendship was genuine and deep, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to their unusual vision of outlaw life as something approaching a noble calling. Yet even during these golden years, careful observers might have detected the seeds of future conflict and eventual dissolution. Dutch's ego, carefully managed by Hosea's diplomatic skills, occasionally displayed a need for recognition and validation that suggested underlying insecurities about his leadership and his vision. His rhetoric about freedom and justice sometimes became abstract to the point of disconnection from practical realities, leading to decisions that served his psychological needs rather than the gang's best interests. Similarly, the gang's criminal activities, however carefully justified through elaborate moral frameworks, inevitably involved violence and trauma that left psychological scars on both perpetrators and victims. The accumulation of these experiences, combined with the constant stress of life outside the law, created pressures that would eventually test every relationship and every loyalty within the gang's carefully constructed community. The influence of Annabelle, Dutch's beloved who was killed during a failed robbery, cast a long shadow over these golden years, even though her death preceded the gang's full formation. Her loss had fundamentally changed Dutch's relationship with both love and violence, introducing elements of bitterness and fatalism into his previously optimistic worldview. The memorial he created to her memory became a shrine to his own capacity for loss, a constant reminder of the price that outlaw life could exact from those who chose to live it. As we observe these golden years from the perspective of what would follow, we can see how they established both the strengths that would carry the gang through years of success and the weaknesses that would ultimately destroy them. The loyalty and trust forged during this period would prove strong enough to survive betrayal, imprisonment, and death, yet the very intensity of these bonds would make their eventual breaking all the more devastating for those who experienced it. The Van der Linde gang's golden years represent both the promise and the impossibility of Dutch's vision, demonstrating that genuine community and mutual care could flourish even under the most challenging circumstances, while also revealing the fundamental contradictions that made such arrangements ultimately unsustainable. They created something beautiful and meaningful that was also inherently tragic, knowing from the beginning that their way of life could not endure the changes that were transforming the American frontier into something entirely different from the world they had chosen to inhabit. The Blackwater ferry job was supposed to be their masterpiece, the culmination of years of careful planning and preparation that would finally provide the Van der Linde gang with enough money to disappear forever into the kind of life that Dutch had always envisioned for them. Instead, it became the catastrophe that shattered their golden age and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything they had built together over the course of nearly 2 decades. What should have been a routine robbery, the kind of operation they had executed dozens of times before with clockwork precision, devolved into a massacre that left the streets of Blackwater running with blood and the gang fleeing into the wilderness, with half their number dead or missing, and the full weight of the law bearing down upon them with unprecedented fury. The exact details of what went wrong that day in May of 1899 remain shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obfuscation, but the consequences were immediately and devastatingly clear to anyone with eyes to see. Dutch van der Linde, that master of rhetoric and careful planning, found himself for perhaps the first time in his adult life completely without answers, without the philosophical framework that had always allowed him to transform even their worst failures into moral victories. The careful balance of idealism and pragmatism that had sustained the gang through years of increasingly dangerous criminal activities collapsed under the weight of a disaster so complete that it challenged every assumption they had made about their own competence and invulnerability. The ferry itself had seemed like the perfect target, a floating symbol of the kind of corporate wealth that Dutch loved to rail against in his evening speeches around the campfire. The boat carried not just passengers, but substantial amounts of cash belonging to banking interests and government officials, money that Dutch could convince himself they were liberating rather than stealing. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity, refined through months of careful observation and preparation, until every detail seemed accounted for. Yet somehow, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and in ways that suggested either catastrophic bad luck or deliberate betrayal by someone with intimate knowledge of their methods and intentions. The law enforcement response was too quick and too well coordinated to be accidental, arriving with a force and determination that indicated they had been expecting trouble rather than responding to an unexpected crisis. Mac Callender died in the initial gunfight, cut down by Pinkerton bullets before he could even reach the ferry, his dreams of easy money and comfortable retirement ending in the mud and blood of Blackwater's waterfront. Davy Callender, wounded but still breathing, managed to escape with the others into the wilderness, only to die slowly and agonizingly during their desperate flight through the mountains, his life ebbing away with each painful step as the gang carried him higher into the snow-covered peaks of the Grizzlies. The loss of the Calendar brothers represented more than just a reduction in their fighting strength or a tragic waste of young life. Mac and Davy had been true believers in Dutch's vision, loyal soldiers who never questioned orders and never complained about the hardships of outlaw life. Their death served as a brutal reminder that loyalty and dedication provided no protection against the random cruelties of their chosen profession, that all their talk of honor and brotherhood meant nothing when measured against the simple physics of lead bullets traveling at lethal velocities. Jenny Kirk, one of the few women who had proven herself capable of participating directly in the gang's criminal activities, rather than being relegated to support roles, also perished during the chaotic retreat from Blackwater. Her death hit the surviving gang members with particular force, not just because of personal affection, but because it shattered their comforting illusion that their unconventional family could somehow protect its most vulnerable members from the violence that surrounded them. The flight into the Grizzly Mountains during one of the harshest winters in recent memory transformed what should have been a temporary tactical retreat into an ordeal that tested every bond of loyalty and mutual support that the gang had developed over the years. The bitter cold that numbed their fingers and froze their breath also seemed to freeze the warmth and camaraderie that had sustained them through previous difficulties, replacing it with a desperate focus on simple survival that left little room for the philosophical discussions and communal decision-making that had once defined their daily existence. Coulter, the abandoned mining town where they finally took shelter, became both sanctuary and prison, a place where they could hide from their pursuers, but where the enforced proximity and shared hardship gradually revealed stress fractures in relationships that had seemed unshakable just weeks before. The comfortable routines of their previous life, the morning coffee and evening conversations that had given structure and meaning to their days, were replaced by the grim necessities of rationing food, maintaining fires, and treating the wounded while keeping watch for signs of approaching lawmen. Arthur Morgan, that stalwart lieutenant whose loyalty to Dutch had never wavered through years of increasingly dangerous operations, found himself questioning not just the wisdom of the Blackwater job, but the entire philosophical framework that Dutch used to justify their criminal activities. The deaths of people he had considered family, combined with the obvious signs of Dutch's psychological distress, forced Arthur to confront the possibility that the man he had followed without question for most of his adult life might be fallible, might even be fundamentally wrong about the nature of their struggle and their chances for ultimate success. John Marston's reaction to the disaster was characteristically different, more focused on immediate practical concerns than philosophical implications. John had always been more skeptical of Dutch's grand rhetoric, more interested in the concrete benefits of gang membership than its supposed moral significance. The Blackwater massacre confirmed his suspicions that Dutch's idealism was becoming increasingly disconnected from the realities of their situation, that the gap between noble intentions and brutal consequences was widening to the point where it could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The mysterious disappearance of the money they had fought and died for added insult to the injury of their devastating losses. Dutch claimed to have hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere they could retrieve it once the immediate danger had passed, but his evasiveness about the specific location and his obvious reluctance to discuss the matter suggested that the situation was more complicated than he was willing to admit. Whether the money had been lost in the chaos of their retreat, seized by law enforcement, or deliberately hidden by Dutch for reasons of his own remained a source of speculation and growing distrust among the surviving gang members. Micah Bell's behavior, During and after the Blackwater job began to display the first clear signs of the treachery that would eventually tear the gang apart from within. While he had always been prone to violence and possessed a cruel streak that made him unpopular with many gang members, his actions in the aftermath of the massacre suggested a fundamental shift in his loyalties and priorities. His whispered conversations with Dutch, his apparent immunity from criticism despite obvious failures of judgment, and his growing influence over gang decisions created an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment that poisoned the trust upon which their entire organization depended. The weeks they spent trapped in the mountains of Ambarino provided ample time for reflection and recrimination, for the kind of soul-searching conversations that might have helped them process their trauma and emerge stronger as a group. Instead, the enforced isolation seemed to amplify their differences and grievances, creating echo chambers where doubt and bitterness could grow without the moderating influence of external perspectives or new experiences. Hosea Matthews, that voice of wisdom and moderation who had always served as a counterbalance to Dutch's more extreme impulses, found his influence waning as Dutch became increasingly defensive about his leadership decisions and unwilling to accept criticism or alternative viewpoints. The partnership that had been the foundation of the gang's success for nearly 20 years began to show signs of strain that would only worsen as circumstances forced them into increasingly desperate situations. The eventual descent from the mountains into the heartlands represented both physical and psychological transition, a movement from the sterile purity of snow-covered peaks into the messy complexity of a world that was changing faster than they could adapt to it. The settlements they encountered, the people they met, and the opportunities they discovered all served as reminders that the America they had known was disappearing, replaced by something more organized, more connected, and far less tolerant of the kind of criminal enterprise that had sustained them for so long. Valentine, that rough frontier town where they established their next camp, offered both familiar comforts and unsettling signs of change. The saloons and general stores, the livestock pens and train station all recalled the simpler world of their earlier operations, yet the presence of telephone lines and newspaper reports, the efficiency of law enforcement communication, and the sophistication of criminal investigation techniques suggested that their traditional methods were becoming increasingly obsolete. The gang's attempts to rebuild their financial resources through a series of smaller operations met with mixed success at best, each job carrying risks that seemed disproportionate to the potential rewards. The easy targets of their golden years, the isolated banks and poorly defended stagecoaches that had provided steady income with minimal danger, were being replaced by more sophisticated security measures that required correspondingly elaborate planning and execution. Arthur Morgan's growing illness, the tuberculosis that he contracted from Thomas Downs during a debt collection that went tragically wrong, became both metaphor and practical challenge for a gang that was already struggling to maintain its cohesion and effectiveness. The disease that slowly consumed Arthur's strength and vitality seemed to mirror the gradual dissolution of the bonds that had once held the gang together, the way that external pressures and internal contradictions were eating away at the foundations of their shared existence. The symbolism of Arthur's condition was not lost on those who possessed the philosophical sophistication to recognize it. Here was their strongest and most loyal member, the man who had embodied the best qualities of Dutch's vision while remaining grounded in practical reality, being destroyed by the consequences of their criminal activities in the most literal and unavoidable way possible. His coughing fits during quiet moments, his increasing fatigue during operations that should have been routine, and his growing introspection about the meaning and value of their chosen life all served as constant reminders of mortality and consequence that no amount of rhetoric could explain away. The gang's relationship with the various communities they encountered during their eastward migration revealed the extent to which their isolation had distorted their understanding of how the world was changing around them. The people they met in towns like Valentine and Strawberry, Rhodes and St. Denis were not the simple frontier folk of their earlier experience, but representatives of a more complex and interconnected society that was developing its own institutions and values independent of the old patterns of frontier individualism. These communities had their own problems, their own conflicts and contradictions, but they also possessed resources and organizational capabilities that far exceeded what isolated groups like the Van der Linde gang could hope to match. The Braithwaite and Gray families, despite their mutual hatred and destructive feuding, commanded economic and political power that dwarfed anything the gang could achieve through criminal activities. Even their corruption and violence operated within legal and social frameworks that provided them with legitimacy and protection that outlaws could never enjoy. The disastrous bank robbery in St. Denis, that supposed crown jewel of civilization in the American South, represented the culmination of all the miscalculations and misunderstandings that had plagued the gang since Blackwater. Dutch's plan to strike at the heart of legitimate commerce, to demonstrate that their criminal enterprise could challenge established power on its own ground, instead revealed how completely outmatched they had become by the forces arrayed against them. The death of Hosea Matthews during the St. Denis job marked the end of whatever remained of the gang's golden age, the final severing of the connection to their earlier success and happiness. Hosea's wisdom and moderation had been the counterweight that prevented Dutch's idealism from becoming fanaticism, his practical knowledge the foundation upon which their criminal operations had been built. Without his influence, Dutch's decision-making became increasingly erratic and self-destructive, driven more by ego and desperation than by the careful calculation that had once made him such an effective leader. The capture and subsequent rescue of John Marston created additional stress and division within the group, forcing them to choose between abandoning a loyal member and risking everything in a rescue attempt that had little chance of success. The decision to save John, while morally admirable and consistent with their stated values of loyalty and mutual support, also demonstrated how their emotional attachments were leading them to make tactically disastrous choices that prioritized sentiment over survival. The exile to Guarma, that tropical prison where they found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control, served as a crucible that revealed the true character of each gang member, while stripping away the comfortable illusions that had sustained them through their previous difficulties. On that Caribbean island, surrounded by unfamiliar dangers and cut off from everything they had known, the gang's carefully constructed identity began to dissolve under pressures that no amount of philosophical rhetoric could address. Dutch's behavior on Guarma, his increasing paranoia and violence, his growing obsession with grandiose schemes that had little connection to practical reality, provided disturbing evidence of psychological deterioration that could no longer be explained away as temporary stress or tactical adaptation. The man who had once inspired loyalty through vision and genuine care for his followers was becoming someone else entirely, someone driven by pride and fear rather than principle and compassion. The island's brutal tropical environment, with its unfamiliar diseases and hostile inhabitants, seemed to accelerate the process of dissolution that had begun with the Blackwater disaster. Gang members who had stood together through years of hardship found themselves questioning not just their leadership but each other, wondering whether the bonds they had thought unbreakable were actually as fragile as everything else in their increasingly uncertain world. Arthur Morgan's journal entries during this period reveal the depth of his growing disillusionment with Dutch and his methods, the way that physical illness was combining with moral clarity to help him see their situation without the romantic embellishments that had once made it seem noble and worthwhile. His sketches and observations capture both the beauty of the tropical landscape and the horror of their circumstances, the way that natural splendor could coexist with human brutality and moral degradation. The return from Guam brought them back to an America that seemed even more hostile to their presence than the one they had left, where their names were known to law enforcement agencies across multiple states, and their methods had been studied and countered by investigators who understood them better than they understood themselves. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, in particular, had developed sophisticated techniques for tracking and apprehending criminal organizations that rendered many of the gang's traditional security measures obsolete. The final camps in Beaver Hollow, in those caves and clearings that seemed to echo with the ghosts of their former happiness, became stages for the working out of conflicts and resentments that had been building since Blackwater. The physical environment itself seemed to reflect their spiritual deterioration, the dank caves and twisted trees serving as appropriate backdrop for conversations about betrayal and revenge, loyalty and abandonment. Micah Bell's growing influence over Dutch during these final weeks represented the complete inversion of everything the gang had once stood for, the triumph of cynicism and self-interest over the ideals of mutual support and social justice that had originally justified their criminal activities. The man who had once spoken eloquently about taking from the rich to help the poor was now planning operations that would benefit only himself and his most loyal followers, abandoning the broader community that had sustained him through decades of hardship and danger. The inevitable confrontation between Arthur Morgan and Dutch van der Linde, between the practical morality of the working outlaw and the abstract philosophy of the revolutionary leader, played out against a backdrop of physical and emotional exhaustion that made rational discussion almost impossible. Both men were trapped by their histories and their commitments, unable to find a way forward that would preserve what they valued most while acknowledging the realities of their situation. As the van der Linde gang finally disintegrated in those caves beneath the New Hanover Mountains, as friendships dissolved and loyalties shifted, and the dream of freedom through criminal enterprise finally died, the survivors were left to contemplate the ruins of something that had once been beautiful and meaningful. The golden age was over, destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions that had always lurked beneath its surface, waiting for the right combination of pressure and circumstances to tear it apart from within. The great unraveling from Blackwater to Guam represents more than just the decline and fall of a criminal organization, more than just another cautionary tale about the inevitable fate of those who choose to live outside the law. It stands as testimony to the possibility of genuine human connection and mutual care under even the most challenging circumstances, while also demonstrating the fragility of such bonds when tested by the kind of pressures that their chosen way of life inevitably generated. The legendary gunslingers of the American frontier existed in that peculiar space between historical fact and mythological embellishment, where the harsh realities of violence and survival became transformed through repetition and imagination into something approaching modern folklore. These figures, scattered across the vast territories of the West during its final decades, represented both the promise and the tragedy of frontier individualism, embodying ideals of personal freedom and rough justice, while simultaneously demonstrating the brutal costs that such ideals extracted from those who attempted to live by them. Black Bell stands as perhaps the most compelling example of how the frontier could reshape traditional expectations and create opportunities for those whom conventional society would never have recognized or celebrated. In an age when women were expected to remain within carefully circumscribed domestic roles, Bell carved out a space for herself in the masculine world of professional gunfighting that defied every assumption about gender, propriety, and the supposed natural order of frontier society. Her story begins in the borderlands between Texas and Mexico, where the absence of effective law enforcement and the presence of substantial wealth in the form of cattle and silver created opportunities for those bold enough and skilled enough to seize them. Belle's initiation into the criminal life came not through philosophical conviction or economic desperation, but through the simple recognition that she possessed abilities that could be profitable in an environment where violence was both commonplace and, under certain circumstances, socially acceptable. The transformation of a young woman whose name has been lost to history into the legendary Black Belle required not just exceptional skill with firearms, but also a kind of psychological toughness that enabled her to function effectively in situations that would have broken most people regardless of their gender. The frontier demanded a certain callousness from all its inhabitants, but for a woman operating in explicitly masculine spheres, the requirements were even more stringent, the margin for error even smaller. Belle's reputation was built through a series of increasingly audacious robberies and gunfights that demonstrated not just her individual competence, but her ability to organize and lead others in complex criminal enterprises. Unlike many frontier outlaws who operated alone or in small, informal groups, Belle commanded what amounted to a small army of followers who respected her judgment and followed her orders with the kind of discipline usually associated with military organizations. The respect she earned from her contemporaries, including hardened criminals who would normally have dismissed any woman's pretensions to leadership, testified to qualities that transcended simple marksmanship or tactical intelligence. Belle possessed that rare combination of charisma and competence that allowed her to inspire loyalty while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for making life and death decisions about people who trusted her with their lives. Her encounters with Jim Boy Calloway revealed the complex dynamics that existed between different types of frontier legends, the way that genuine accomplishment could coexist with deliberate self-promotion, and how the line between authentic heroism and calculated performance was often impossible to draw with any certainty. Calloway represented a different model of frontier celebrity, one based more on careful cultivation of image than on actual achievement, yet his success in creating and maintaining his reputation demonstrated skills that were no less valuable for being primarily theatrical. The truth behind Calloway's carefully constructed persona was both more mundane and more interesting than his admirers wanted to believe. Rather than the fearless gunfighter of popular imagination, he was essentially a professional performer who had discovered that audiences were hungry for stories about frontier violence and individual heroism, and who had developed the ability to provide those stories in ways that satisfied their psychological needs while generating substantial income for himself. Calloway's genius lay not in his ability with weapons, which was competent but unremarkable, but in his understanding of how myths were created and maintained in frontier society. He recognized that people needed to believe in the existence of larger-than-life figures who embodied their highest aspirations and their deepest fantasies about personal freedom and individual agency. By positioning himself as such a figure, he was able to build a career that was both more sustainable and more profitable than anything actual gunfighting could have provided. The relationship between Calloway and the other gunslingers he claimed as associates was complicated by the fact that his success depended partly on their genuine reputations, while also undermining those reputations through his obvious artificiality. Men like Billy Midnight and Emmett Granger had earned their places in frontier legend through actions that carried real risks and produced genuine consequences. Yet Calloway's ability to profit from association with their names suggested that the distinction between authentic achievement and skillful performance was less important to the public than the stories themselves. Billy Midnight's trajectory from celebrated gunfighter to broken alcoholic illustrated the psychological costs that frontier violence could exact from even its most successful practitioners. Unlike Calloway, whose career was built on careful avoidance of genuine danger, Midnight had earned his reputation through a series of gunfights that left him with both fame and trauma, recognition that came at the price of his peace of mind and emotional stability. The skills that made Midnight formidable in combat, the hypervigilance and hair-trigger reflexes that had kept him alive through dozens of potentially fatal encounters, became liabilities in civilian life, making normal social interaction difficult and peaceful existence nearly impossible. The same psychological mechanisms that had enabled him to function effectively in life or death situations now tormented him during quiet moments, filling his mind with scenarios of violence and betrayal that alcohol could temporarily quiet, but never permanently resolve. Midnight's decline from celebrated gunfighter to pathetic drunk represented more than just personal tragedy, though it was certainly that. His story revealed the fundamental unsustainability of the frontier's cult of individual violence, the way that a society built around the glorification of armed conflict inevitably produced casualties among both its victims and its supposed victors. The skills that frontier society celebrated and rewarded were the same skills that made their possessors unfit for the peaceful civilization that society was simultaneously trying to create. The irony of Midnight's situation was that his genuine accomplishments, the victories that had made him famous and feared, had also made him incapable of enjoying the benefits that fame and fear should have provided. Unlike Calloway, who could perform the role of gunfighter while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for psychological health, Midnight had internalized his role so completely that he could never escape from it, never find relief from the constant tension and suspicion that had kept him alive but was now slowly killing him. Emmett Granger's transformation from feared gunslinger to prosperous pig farmer offered a different model for how frontier violence could be integrated into civilian life, though one that came with its own moral complexities and psychological costs. Granger had possessed both the skills and the temperament necessary for success as a professional killer, but he had also retained enough flexibility and self-awareness to recognize when circumstances required a change in career direction. The pig farm that Granger established in the years following his retirement from active gunfighting represented both a practical solution to the problem of making a living without constantly risking his life, and a symbolic commentary on the relationship between civilization and barbarism. The same qualities that had made him effective as a killer, the attention to detail and comfort with violence, served him equally well in the business of raising livestock for slaughter. Granger's pigs, fed on a diet that may have included more than conventional farm waste, grew to exceptional size and quality, producing meat that commanded premium prices in the markets of nearby settlements. The whispered rumors about what exactly those pigs were eating and where Granger obtained his supply of feed added an element of dark humor to his transition from outlaw to entrepreneur, while also suggesting that the line between legal and illegal enterprise was often more fluid than respectable society cared to acknowledge. The success of Granger's farming operation demonstrated that the skills developed through criminal activity could be channeled into legitimate pursuits, but it also revealed how those skills continued to shape their possessors' approach to ostensibly respectable activities. Granger's methods might have been technically legal, but they retained enough of their earlier moral ambiguity to make his neighbors uncomfortable even as they continued to purchase his products. Flaco Hernandez operated in the borderlands between the United States and Mexico, that liminal space where national laws held little sway and personal reputation was often the only currency that mattered. His domain in the mountains of northern Mexico provided him with both sanctuary from American law enforcement and access to the trade routes that connected the mining regions of the interior with the commercial centers of Texas and New Mexico. The geography of Hernandez's operations reflected the broader patterns of frontier criminal enterprise. The way that successful outlaws learned to exploit the jurisdictional gaps and communication delays that characterized law enforcement in sparsely settled regions. His mountain stronghold was positioned to take advantage of these systemic weaknesses, offering multiple escape routes while maintaining command of the passes that travelers were forced to use when crossing between countries. Hernandez's reputation for both cruelty and honor, for keeping his word when given while showing no mercy to those who crossed him, illustrated the complex moral codes that governed frontier criminal societies. These codes were not simply arbitrary rules, but practical systems for managing risk and maintaining the trust necessary for successful cooperation in illegal enterprises. They served both to limit the scope of criminal violence and to ensure that when violence did occur, it followed predictable patterns that all participants could understand and plan for. The stories told about Hernandez in the cantinas and trading posts of the borderlands revealed how frontier communities developed their own systems for categorizing and evaluating the criminal figures who moved through their partners' territories. Unlike the simplified morality tales that civilized society preferred, these stories acknowledged the complexity and ambiguity of men who operated outside legal frameworks while still being subject to various forms of social pressure and expectation. The relationships between these legendary gunslingers and the communities they moved through reflected the broader tensions between individual freedom and social responsibility that defined frontier life. Towns like Valentine and Strawberry, Armadillo and Tumbleweed existed in a constant state of negotiation with the criminal elements that passed through their territories, seeking to balance the economic benefits that such visitors might provide against the risks their presence inevitably entailed. The arrival of a famous gunslinger in a frontier settlement created both opportunities and dangers that local authorities had to manage with considerable diplomatic skill. Such figures brought money to spend on lodging, food, and entertainment, but they also brought the possibility of violence that could disrupt local business and attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. The challenge for local leaders was to extract whatever economic benefits were available while minimizing the potential for catastrophic disruption. This delicate balance was made more complex by the fact that many frontier communities depended partly on criminal activity for their economic survival. Towns that served as stopping points for cattle rustlers, train robbers, and other criminal enterprises often developed symbiotic relationships with their illegal visitors, providing services and information in exchange for a share of criminal profits. These arrangements required careful management and considerable discretion, as they could easily attract the attention of federal authorities who were less susceptible to local influence and accommodation. The stranger missions that brought figures like Arthur Morgan into contact with these legendary gunslingers served as windows into a world that was already passing into history by the time of the Van der Linde gang's final years. The aging gunfighters that Arthur encountered represented the remnants of an earlier era, men and women whose prime had coincided with the frontier's wildest and most violent period, but who were now struggling to find their place in a world that was becoming increasingly organized and law-abiding. The conversations between Arthur and these legendary figures revealed the psychological toll that frontier violence had taken on its practitioners, the way that years of constant danger and moral ambiguity had shaped their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. These were not the romantic heroes of popular imagination, but complex individuals carrying the accumulated weight of choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but whose consequences continued to reverberate through their lives. Black Belle's defiance in the face of changing times, her refusal to abandon the life that had brought her both fame and fulfillment, despite its increasing dangers, represented one possible response to the frontier's transformation. Rather than adapting to new circumstances as Emmett Granger had done, or retreating into alcohol-fueled nostalgia like Billy Midnight, she chose to maintain her commitment to the values and practices that had defined her identity, regardless of their growing irrelevance to contemporary conditions. This stubborn consistency commanded a certain respect even from those who recognized its ultimate futility. Belle's unwillingness to compromise her principles or moderate her behavior in response to changing social expectations demonstrated a kind of integrity that was both admirable and ultimately self-destructive. She remained true to herself and her vision of how life should be lived, but at the cost of increasingly marginalizing herself from a society that was moving in directions she refused to follow. The stories of these legendary gunslingers collectively illustrate the complex relationship between individual agency and historical change, the way that personal choices and broader social transformations interact to shape individual destinies. Each figure responded differently to the pressures and opportunities of their time, making choices that reflected their particular personalities, circumstances, and values. Yet all were ultimately constrained by forces beyond their individual control, by economic and social changes that rendered their specialized skills increasingly obsolete. The frontier created these legends by providing an environment where exceptional individual ability could translate directly into fame, fortune, and influence in ways that more organized societies rarely permit. The absence of established institutions and formal social hierarchies created opportunities for self-made individuals to rise to prominence through their own efforts, regardless of their background or conventional qualifications. This was both the promise and the peril of frontier society, its greatest strength and its fundamental weakness. As the frontier era drew to its close, these legendary figures became living reminders of what was being lost, as well as what was being gained through the process of civilization. Their stories preserved memories of a time when individual courage and skill could triumph over seemingly impossible odds, when personal freedom was limited primarily by one's own abilities and willingness to accept risk. Yet they also demonstrated the costs of such freedom, the violence and instability that were its inevitable companions. The transformation of these historical figures into mythological archetypes began even during their lifetimes, as storytellers and journalists crafted narratives that emphasized their most dramatic and heroic qualities, while downplaying the moral ambiguities and psychological complexities that made them fully human. This process of mythologization served important social functions, providing communities with symbols of strength and independence that could inspire courage and reinforce cultural values. Yet it also distorted the historical record, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction in accounts of frontier life. The legacy of these legendary gunslingers extends far beyond their individual stories, influencing how subsequent generations have understood the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility, between personal agency and collective welfare. Their examples continue to resonate in contemporary culture, providing both inspiration and cautionary tales for those seeking to understand the possibilities and limitations of life lived outside conventional social structures. In their courage and their flaws, their triumphs and their tragedies, we find reflections of eternal human struggles that transcend the specific circumstances of the American frontier, while remaining forever shaped by the unique conditions that created them. The vast wilderness of America held secrets that defied easy explanation, mysteries that existed at the edges of human understanding, where the rational mind struggled to make sense of experiences that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. These were not the simple puzzles of human motivation or criminal enterprise, but phenomena that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, as if the continent's ancient forces had their own agenda that intersected only occasionally and unpredictably with the concerns of those who sought to tame and civilize its endless expanses. In the remote corners of New Hanover and West Elizabeth, in the shadowed valleys of the Grizzly Mountains and the mist-shrouded bayous of Lemoyne, travelers reported encounters with beings and occurrences that belonged more properly to the realm of folklore than to the documented history of westward expansion. Yet these accounts persisted across decades and geographical regions, told by witnesses whose reliability in other matters was beyond question, creating a body of testimony that could not be dismissed entirely despite its obvious challenges to conventional understanding. The strange man represented perhaps the most enigmatic of these frontier mysteries, a figure whose appearances were documented across multiple states and territories over a span of years that suggested either supernatural longevity or the existence of multiple individuals sharing some inexplicable common purpose. Those who encountered him described a well-dressed gentleman of indeterminate age, whose knowledge of private affairs and future events exceeded what any normal person could reasonably possess through conventional means. His conversations with travelers like John Marston revealed an understanding of human nature that seemed to transcend ordinary psychological insight, as if he possessed access to information about people's innermost thoughts and motivations that they had never shared with another living soul. The questions he posed were precisely calibrated to expose moral contradictions and unresolved conflicts, delivered with a courtesy that made them all the more unsettling for those who found themselves unable to provide satisfactory answers. The strange man's apparent omniscience extended beyond mere knowledge of personal history to encompass an understanding of broader patterns and future developments that suggested either prophetic ability or access to information, networks that operated far beyond the technological capabilities of the era. His predictions about the fate of individuals and communities proved accurate with disturbing consistency, creating the impression that he was not merely observing events, but somehow participating in their orchestration. The cabin that could be found in the remote bayous of Lemoyne, decorated with paintings that seemed to depict scenes from the lives of people who had encountered the strange man, provided physical evidence that his influence extended beyond mere conversation into the realm of artistic creation. The paintings themselves were executed with technical skill that suggested professional training, yet their content revealed knowledge of private moments and personal struggles that no conventional artist could have witnessed. The psychological impact of these encounters extended far beyond their immediate participants, creating ripples of unease that spread through frontier communities as stories were shared and embellished through countless retellings. The strange man became a figure of almost mythological significance, a personification of the moral ambiguity that characterized frontier life, and a reminder that actions carried consequences that extended beyond their immediate visible effects. Some frontier philosophers and amateur theologians interpreted the strange man as a manifestation of divine justice, a supernatural agent whose function was to confront individuals with the moral implications of their choices and guide them toward redemption or damnation according to their responses. This interpretation provided a comforting framework for understanding encounters that might otherwise have seemed meaningless or malevolent, transforming a source of fear into an opportunity for spiritual growth and self-examination. Others viewed him as a more sinister presence, a demonic figure whose knowledge and power were employed not for moral instruction but for the corruption and destruction of human souls. The precision of his psychological manipulation, The way he could identify and exploit individual weaknesses with surgical accuracy suggested to these observers a malevolent intelligence whose ultimate purpose was the promotion of suffering and moral degradation. The truth, if such a concept had any meaning in relation to phenomena that defied conventional categorization, probably lay somewhere between these extremes, in a space where human categories of good and evil proved inadequate for understanding entities whose existence operated according to principles that transcended ordinary moral frameworks. The strange man seemed to function as a kind of cosmic auditor, examining the books of human behavior without expressing particular preference for any specific outcome beyond the revelation of truth in all its uncomfortable complexity. The UFO sightings that occurred with surprising frequency across the American territories during the 1890s represented a different category of frontier mystery, one that challenged assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos rather than individuals' relationships with moral law. These encounters, documented by witnesses whose credibility in other matters was beyond reproach, suggested that the vast skies above the American frontier concealed visitors whose origins and purposes remained completely unknown to earthbound observers. The consistency of these reports across widely separated geographical regions and diverse cultural communities suggested that whatever was being observed possessed objective reality beyond the realm of mass hallucination or cultural mythology. Witnesses from different backgrounds and belief systems described similar phenomena using remarkably consistent terminology, creating a body of testimony that resisted easy dismissal despite its obviously extraordinary nature. The craft that were observed, typically during the dark hours before dawn or in the deep twilight of evening, displayed capabilities that far exceeded anything achievable through contemporary human technology. They moved through the atmosphere with a silence and fluidity that suggested mastery of physical principles that remained unknown to terrestrial science, appearing and disappearing with a suddenness that challenged observers' ability to track their movements or predict their behavior. The psychological impact of these sightings on frontier communities was profound and complex, simultaneously inspiring awe and terror, while challenging fundamental assumptions about humanity's relationship to the broader universe. For people whose daily existence was already characterized by uncertainty and danger, the possibility that the night sky concealed intelligences whose power and intentions remained unknowable added another layer of mystery to lives that were already saturated with unanswered questions. Some witnesses interpreted these encounters as evidence of divine presence, manifestations of celestial beings whose appearances served to remind humanity of its limitations and dependencies. This interpretation drew upon religious traditions that associated the heavens with supernatural activity, providing a familiar framework for understanding phenomena that might otherwise have seemed threatening or meaningless. Others speculated about the possibility of visitors from distant worlds, extraterrestrial intelligences whose advanced technology enabled them to traverse the vast distances between stars and observe human civilization from a perspective that was literally otherworldly. This interpretation, while lacking the comforting familiarity of religious explanation, offered its own form of intellectual satisfaction by suggesting that humanity was part of a larger cosmic community that extended far beyond the boundaries of Earth. The locations where these sightings occurred most frequently, typically remote areas far from established settlements where artificial lights would not interfere with celestial observation, became pilgrimage sites of sorts for those seeking their own encounters with the unknown. Mount Shan and other elevated locations offered clear views of the night sky, while providing the isolation necessary for phenomena that seemed to avoid areas of dense human population. The night folk of the Lemoyne bayous represented a different category of frontier mystery entirely, one rooted not in supernatural manifestations, but in the persistence of human cultures that had adapted to environmental conditions in ways that placed them far outside the boundaries of conventional civilization. These shadowy figures, glimpsed occasionally by travelers brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the deepest and most inaccessible regions of the swamplands, seemed to exist according to social and behavioral patterns that predated European colonization by centuries, if not millennia. Their nocturnal activities and apparent comfort with environments that most people found hostile and terrifying suggested a relationship with the natural world that was fundamentally different from that of settler communities. Where conventional frontier culture sought to impose human order upon natural chaos, the night folk seemed to have found ways of integrating themselves into existing ecological systems without disrupting their fundamental patterns. The violence that characterized encounters between the night folk and outside visitors appeared to stem not from random malice, but from a systematic defense of territorial boundaries that outsiders could neither recognize nor respect. Their attacks followed patterns that suggested ritual significance as well as practical purpose, as if the killing of intruders served symbolic functions within their cultural system, while also eliminating potential threats to their security and autonomy. The linguistic evidence gathered from these encounters, fragmentary and difficult to interpret though it was, suggested that the night folk had maintained distinct cultural traditions that incorporated elements from multiple Native American, African, and European sources while synthesizing them into something entirely unique. Their language, to the extent that it could be understood by outside observers, seemed to draw vocabulary and grammatical structures from diverse linguistic families while organizing them according to principles that reflected their particular environmental and social circumstances. The settlements that existed within night folk territory, if they could properly be called settlements, appeared to be organized around principles that prioritized concealment and mobility over the permanent construction that characterized conventional frontier communities. These temporary installations could be dismantled and relocated with remarkable speed, allowing their inhabitants to avoid detection while maintaining access to the resources they required for survival. The relationship between the night folk and other criminal elements operating within the Lemoyne region revealed interesting parallels and contrasts between different forms of social organization that existed outside legal frameworks. Where conventional outlaws typically maintained some connection to mainstream society through their dependence on legitimate businesses for supplies and services, the night folk appeared to operate according to entirely self-sufficient systems that required minimal interaction with the outside world. Edmund Lowry Jr. represented yet another category of frontier mystery, one that emerged not from supernatural phenomena or ancient cultural traditions, but from the psychological pathologies that frontier conditions seem to encourage in certain predisposed individuals. His systematic murders, characterized by elaborate ritualistic elements and careful documentation of his methods and motivations, revealed how the relative absence of law enforcement in sparsely populated regions could enable criminal behavior that would have been impossible to sustain in more densely settled areas. The geographic pattern of Lowry's activities, scattered across multiple territories and jurisdictions, demonstrated his understanding of the administrative weaknesses that characterized frontier law enforcement. By moving frequently and avoiding the establishment of recognizable patterns that might have enabled prediction of his future activities, he was able to continue his crimes for an extended period while remaining largely invisible to the various agencies that might have been able to stop him. The artistic pretensions that characterized Lowry's work, his apparent belief that his murders represented a form of creative expression that would be appreciated by future generations, revealed the complex psychology of an individual who had found ways of justifying extreme antisocial behavior through elaborate intellectual frameworks. His journals and correspondence, discovered after his eventual capture, provided disturbing insights into the mental processes of someone who had completely separated moral reasoning from emotional empathy. The victims that Lowry selected seemed to have been chosen according to criteria that combined practical considerations about vulnerability and isolation with aesthetic preferences that reflected his particular psychological needs and artistic sensibilities. The care with which he documented their final moments, preserving details that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying his own creative impulses, suggested that the murders themselves were secondary to the process of creating permanent records of his dominance over other human beings. The investigation that eventually led to Lowry's identification and capture represented one of the most sophisticated criminal detection efforts undertaken in the frontier territories during this period, involving coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and the development of analytical techniques that would later become standard practice in criminal investigation. The success of this effort demonstrated that even the most careful and intelligent criminals could be defeated through systematic application of scientific methods and interjurisdictional cooperation. The witch's cauldron discovered in the remote reaches of Amberino, still bubbling with unknown substances and surrounded by evidence of recent ritual activity, provided physical testimony to the persistence of magical practices that supposedly sophisticated frontier society preferred to believe had been left behind in the superstitious past. The careful arrangement of animal remains and ceremonial objects around the cauldron suggested that someone with considerable knowledge of traditional magical practices was actively employing ancient techniques for purposes that remained completely unknown to outside observers. The substances found within the cauldron defied easy identification, combining recognizable plant materials with other components that seemed to have been gathered from sources that were not immediately obvious to those who examined the site. The complexity of the mixture and the evidence that it had been prepared according to precise specifications rather than random experimentation suggested that whoever had created it possessed detailed knowledge of traditional pharmaceutical and magical practices. The location of the cauldron, in a region far removed from established settlements and accessible only through difficult terrain that would have discouraged casual exploration, indicated that its creators valued secrecy above convenience and were prepared to undertake considerable effort to avoid detection. The temporary nature of the installation, which could be dismantled and relocated with relative ease, suggested that this particular site was part of a larger pattern of activity that might extend across wide geographical areas. The investigation of this site by individuals with knowledge of traditional magical practices revealed that the arrangement of objects and the preparation of substances followed recognizable patterns that could be traced to European, African, and Native American magical traditions. However, the specific combination of elements suggested that whoever was responsible had synthesized influences from multiple cultural sources while adapting them to local environmental conditions and available materials. The ancient ruins scattered throughout the American territories provided evidence of civilizations that had preceded European colonization by centuries or possibly millennia, cultures whose achievements and eventual disappearance remained largely mysterious to contemporary observers. The Zonai constructions found in various remote locations displayed architectural techniques and artistic sensibilities that seemed to represent a completely distinct cultural tradition, one whose relationship to known Native American societies remained unclear, despite extensive speculation by amateur archaeologists and ethnographers. The sophistication of these constructions, particularly their integration with natural landscape features and their apparent astronomical alignments, suggested that their builders possessed advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and celestial mechanics that rivaled or exceeded the achievements of contemporary European civilization. The precision with which massive stone blocks had been shaped and positioned indicated access to techniques and tools that were not immediately apparent from examination of the finished structures. The artistic elements incorporated into these ruins, particularly the spiral motifs and dragon imagery that appeared consistently across widely separated sites, suggested that the Zonai possessed a coherent symbolic system that was employed consistently across their entire cultural area. The repetition of these design elements across different types of structures and geographical regions indicated that they served functions beyond mere decoration, possibly representing religious or astronomical concepts that were central to Zonai civilization. The absence of clear evidence about what had happened to the people who created these remarkable structures added an element of mystery that captured the imagination of everyone who encountered their work. The complete disappearance of a civilization that had obviously possessed considerable technological and artistic capabilities suggested either a catastrophic event that had eliminated them entirely or a gradual migration to regions that remained unknown to contemporary explorers. The spiritual significance that various Native American communities attributed to these ancient sites suggested that some memory of the Zonai and their achievements had been preserved within oral traditions that connected contemporary, indigenous peoples to their prehistoric predecessors. However, the fragmentary nature of these traditions and the reluctance of many communities to share sacred knowledge with outside observers made it difficult to reconstruct accurate historical accounts of what had actually occurred in these locations. The relationship between these various frontier mysteries and the changing character of American society during the final decades of the 19th century reflected broader tensions between rational scientific thinking and traditional forms of knowledge that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. The advance of civilization, with its emphasis on documentation, standardization, and systematic explanation, gradually reduced the spaces where mysterious phenomena could persist without being subjected to analytical scrutiny. Yet the persistence of these mysteries, even in the face of increasing scientific sophistication and technological capability, suggested that certain aspects of human experience would always remain beyond the reach of conventional understanding. The frontier, in its vastness and relative isolation, provided the perfect environment for the preservation and cultivation of mysteries that more densely settled regions would have eliminated through simple exposure to systematic observation and analysis. As the 19th century drew to its close, and the American frontier began its transformation into something more closely resembling conventional civilization, these mysteries began to fade from common experience, retreating into increasingly remote locations where they could continue to exist without interference from the rationalizing forces of modern society. Their legacy, however, continued to influence the way that Americans understood their relationship to the natural world and their place within the larger cosmic order that remained largely unknown, despite all their technological achievements. The communities that dotted the American frontier during the final decades of the 19th century represented far more than simple collections of buildings and businesses scattered across the landscape. They were laboratories of human possibility, experiments in social organization, where people from vastly different backgrounds and traditions found themselves forced to create new forms of community that could accommodate diversity while maintaining enough cohesion to ensure survival. In challenging circumstances, St. Denis stood as the crown jewel of this grand experiment, a city that had grown from humble, colonial beginnings into something that rivaled the great metropolitan centers of the East Coast in sophistication and cultural achievement. The broad boulevards lined with gas lamps, the magnificent theatre district where travelling companies performed the latest works from New York and London, and the bustling commercial districts where merchants from around the world conducted business in multiple languages, all testified to what American civilization could accomplish when resources, ambition, and favourable circumstances aligned. The architecture of St. Denis told the story of cultural synthesis that characterized the best aspects of frontier development. The graceful wrought iron balconies that adorned the French Quarter reflected the city's colonial heritage, while the imposing Greek Revival mansions of the Garden District demonstrated the influence of classical European traditions on American tastes. Yet these familiar styles had been adapted to local conditions and preferences, incorporating design elements that reflected the unique climate and cultural mix of the Louisiana Territory. The economic engine that drove Saint Denis' prosperity was built upon the convergence of multiple transportation networks that made the city a natural hub for commerce throughout the American South. The Mississippi River provided access to markets in the interior of the continent, while railroad connections linked St. Denis to the industrial centers of the Northeast and the agricultural regions of Texas and the Great Plains. This strategic position enabled local merchants and financiers to accumulate the capital necessary for the grand construction projects that transformed their community from a provincial river port into a genuine metropolis. The social hierarchy that emerged in St. Denis reflected both the democratic ideals of American society and the practical realities of wealth concentration that characterized capitalist development throughout the industrializing world. The magnificent balls and cultural events hosted in the grand mansions of the wealthy demonstrated that frontier prosperity could support lifestyles that rivaled those of European aristocracy. Yet the same events also provided opportunities for social mobility that would have been unthinkable in more rigidly stratified societies. The diverse population that called Saint Denis home included not only the descendants of French and Spanish colonists, but also more recent arrivals from across Europe and the African diaspora, creating a cultural mix that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and distinctly American. The cuisine that emerged from this cultural fusion combined French culinary techniques with ingredients and flavors drawn from African, Spanish, and Native American traditions, producing dishes that were both sophisticated and rooted in local agricultural resources. The intellectual life of Saint Denis centered around institutions like the university and the various cultural societies that flourished under the patronage of wealthy benefactors, demonstrated that frontier communities could support the kind of scholarly and artistic pursuits that were typically associated with much older and more established centers of civilization. The libraries and museums, the scientific societies, and literary clubs all provided evidence that material prosperity could be converted into cultural achievement when communities possessed both the resources and the vision necessary for such undertakings. Yet beneath the surface, elegance and cultural sophistication of Saint Denis lay the same tensions and contradictions that characterized American society more broadly during this period of rapid change and development. The wealth that supported the city's magnificent architecture and refined cultural life was built partly upon economic relationships that exploited both natural resources and human labor in ways that benefited the few at the expense of the many. The working-class neighborhoods that surrounded the fashionable districts told a different story of frontier life, one characterized by overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and economic insecurity that contrasted sharply with the prosperity visible in other parts of the city. The immigrants who provided much of the manual labor that kept Saint Denis functioning lived in conditions that were often little better than what they had fled in their countries of origin. Yet they persisted in the hope that hard work and determination would eventually provide their children with access to the opportunities that American society promised to all its citizens. Valentine represented a completely different model of frontier community development, one that prioritized function over form, while still managing to create a social environment that was both vital and welcoming to newcomers. The muddy streets and rough wooden buildings that characterized the town's appearance reflected its origins as a cattle shipping point, a place where practical considerations took precedence over aesthetic concerns or cultural pretensions. The saloons and general stores, the livestock pens and loading docks that dominated Valentine's commercial district served the immediate needs of ranchers, cowboys, and other frontier workers whose livelihoods depended on their ability to move cattle and other agricultural products to distant markets. The architecture was simple and utilitarian, designed to be constructed quickly and cheaply using locally available materials, while providing adequate protection from the elements and sufficient space for commercial activities. Yet despite its rough appearance and boisterous atmosphere, Valentine possessed a genuine sense of community that was built upon shared experiences and mutual dependence, rather than formal social institutions or cultural traditions. The men and women who gathered in the town's establishments came from diverse backgrounds and possessed different skills and interests, but they were united by their common participation in the economic activities that sustained frontier life. The social dynamics of Valentine reflected the democratic ethos that characterized many frontier communities, where individual worth was measured more by competence and reliability than by background or formal credentials. A skilled cowboy or an honest merchant could earn respect and influence regardless of their origins, while someone who failed to meet their obligations or betrayed the trust of their neighbors would find themselves ostracized regardless of their wealth or social connections. The entertainment that flourished in Valentine, from the piano music that echoed from saloon doors to the impromptu horse races that drew crowds of spectators and gamblers, reflected the community's emphasis on immediate pleasure and spontaneous sociability, rather than refined cultural achievement. These activities provided necessary relief from the hardships and isolation of frontier life, while also serving as opportunities for social bonding and the establishment of personal relationships that were essential for survival in challenging circumstances. The relationship between Valentine and the surrounding ranching operations demonstrated how frontier communities developed symbiotic relationships with the economic activities that sustained them. The town provided services and supplies that isolated ranchers could not produce for themselves, while the ranchers provided the commerce and social interaction that made the town economically viable and culturally vital. Strawberry offered yet another variation on the theme of frontier community development, representing an attempt to combine the practical necessities of frontier life with the cultural aspirations and social refinement that characterize more established communities. The town's founders had consciously sought to create a settlement that would attract respectable families and legitimate businesses, rather than the transient population of cowboys and drifters that characterized many frontier communities. The carefully planned layout of Strawberry's streets, the insistence on substantial construction standards for commercial and residential buildings, and the early establishment of institutions like schools and churches all reflected a commitment to creating a community that would endure and prosper, rather than simply serving the immediate needs of extractive industries or transportation networks. The town's leaders understood that sustainable development required investment in infrastructure and institutions that would attract permanent residents and support diverse economic activities. The success of Strawberry in achieving its founders' goals demonstrated that conscious planning and community leadership could shape the character of frontier development in ways that benefited long-term residents while still accommodating the practical realities of frontier economic life. The compromise between idealistic vision and pragmatic necessity that characterized the town's development provided a model for other communities that sought to balance growth with quality of life. The social atmosphere of Strawberry reflected its founders' aspirations toward respectability and cultural refinement, yet it also maintained enough flexibility to accommodate the diverse population that frontier conditions inevitably attracted. The community managed to establish standards of behavior and social expectations that discouraged the kind of violence and lawlessness that characterized some frontier settlements, while still remaining open to newcomers who were willing to contribute to the common good. The economic foundation of Strawberry was more diversified than that of many frontier communities, combining logging and mining operations with agricultural activities and small-scale manufacturing that provided employment opportunities for people with different skills and interests. This economic diversity made the community more resilient to fluctuations in particular industries, while also creating opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation that might not have been available in more specialized frontier settlements. Emerald Ranch represented a unique approach to frontier community development, one that centered around a single extended family's vision of agricultural prosperity and social organization. The Emerald Ranch operation demonstrated how individual initiative and family cooperation could create economic enterprises that provided both material prosperity and social stability for multiple generations of participants. The ranch's approach to land use combined traditional agricultural practices with innovations adapted to local environmental conditions, creating a system of production that was both economically viable and environmentally sustainable. The careful management of grazing lands, the integration of crop production with livestock raising, and the development of water resources all reflected an understanding of ecological relationships that went beyond simple resource extraction. The social organization of Emerald Ranch reflected values of family loyalty and mutual support that provided security and identity for individuals, while also creating the cooperation necessary for complex agricultural operations. The extended family structure that characterized the ranch community provided both economic advantages through the pooling of labor and resources, and social benefits through the maintenance of cultural traditions and personal relationships across generations. The relationship between Emerald Ranch and the surrounding communities demonstrated how successful agricultural enterprises could serve as anchors for broader regional development, providing markets for local goods and services, while also contributing to the social and cultural life of the area. The ranch's prosperity created opportunities for other businesses and entrepreneurs, while its social stability provided a model for community organization that influenced development patterns throughout the region. The Native American communities that persisted throughout the frontier territories during this period faced challenges that were fundamentally different from those encountered by settler communities. Yet their responses demonstrated forms of cultural adaptation and survival that were no less remarkable for being largely invisible to outside observers. The reservation system that had been imposed upon many tribes represented an attempt to solve the problem of cultural conflict through geographical separation. Yet the reality of reservation life was far more complex than the simple isolation that government policy intended. The communities that developed on reservations were forced to balance the preservation of traditional cultural practices with the practical necessity of adapting to new economic and social circumstances that were largely beyond their control. The maintenance of languages, religious practices, and social institutions that connected contemporary tribal members to their ancestral heritage required constant effort and creativity in the face of official policies that often sought to eliminate such connections entirely. The economic activities that sustained reservation communities typically combined traditional practices like hunting and gathering with newer forms of production that could generate the cash income necessary for purchasing manufactured goods and paying taxes. The integration of these different economic systems required innovation and flexibility while also maintaining cultural values that emphasize community welfare over individual accumulation. The political structures that governed reservation communities represented fascinating experiments in democratic governance that combined traditional forms of consensus building with newer institutional forms that were required for interaction with state and federal bureaucracies. The leaders who emerged within these communities needed to possess both deep knowledge of traditional ways and sophisticated understanding of American legal and political systems. The immigrant communities that established themselves throughout the frontier territories brought with them cultural traditions and economic skills that enriched American society, while also creating challenges for social integration and mutual understanding. The Germans who settled in agricultural regions brought with them farming techniques and cultural practices that were well suited to frontier conditions, while Irish and Italian immigrants provided much of the manual labor that built the infrastructure necessary for economic development. The process of cultural adaptation that characterized immigrant communities involved the selective preservation of traditional practices that remained viable in American circumstances, while abandoning or modifying those that were incompatible with frontier conditions. The foodways, religious practices, and social institutions that emerged from this process were distinctly American, while remaining connected to Old World roots in ways that provided identity and continuity across generations. The economic contributions of immigrant communities extended far beyond simple provision of manual labor to encompass entrepreneurship, technological innovation, and cultural enrichment that benefited entire regions. The small businesses, craft production, and specialized services that immigrants established provided economic diversity and cultural vitality that made frontier communities more attractive to other settlers, while also creating opportunities for upward mobility within immigrant families. The Chinese communities that developed in Western territories faced particular challenges due to legal restrictions and social prejudice that limited their economic opportunities and political participation. Yet they managed to create thriving enclaves that preserved cultural traditions, while also contributing significantly to regional economic development. The restaurants, laundries, and other service businesses that Chinese immigrants established filled important economic niches, while their cultural practices added diversity and interest to frontier social life. The process of community formation in frontier territories demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of democratic social organization under conditions of geographic isolation and economic uncertainty. The voluntary associations, informal leadership structures, and cooperative institutions that emerged from these circumstances represented innovative responses to challenges that established communities rarely faced, yet they also revealed persistent patterns of inclusion and exclusion that reflected broader American social prejudices and cultural limitations. The success or failure of particular frontier communities often depended on their ability to balance competing demands for individual freedom and collective responsibility, to accommodate diversity while maintaining enough shared values and purposes to enable effective cooperation. Those communities that managed to achieve this balance created social environments that were both economically productive and personally fulfilling for their residents, while those that failed to do so typically experienced either economic decline or social fragmentation that ultimately led to dissolution or transformation beyond recognition. The legacy of these frontier communities extends far beyond their immediate historical significance to encompass lasting contributions to American culture and social organization. The patterns of community development, the innovations in democratic governance, and the experiments in cultural synthesis that characterized frontier life provided models and inspiration for subsequent generations of Americans who faced their own challenges in creating viable communities under changing circumstances. As we reflect upon these diverse experiments in community building, we can see both the extraordinary creativity and adaptability that frontier conditions encouraged, and the persistent human needs for belonging, security, and cultural meaning that transcended the specific circumstances of time and place. The communities that flourished during America's frontier era demonstrate that human societies can adapt to almost any environment when necessity demands it. Yet they also reveal the ongoing importance of shared values and mutual support in creating the social bonds that make individual survival and prosperity possible. The march of technological progress across the American frontier during the final decades of the 19th century represented far more than the simple introduction of new machines and communication systems into previously isolated regions. It constituted a fundamental transformation in the relationship between human communities and the natural environment, between individual capabilities and collective possibilities, between local autonomy and distant control, that would reshape every aspect of frontier life in ways both profound and subtle. The arrival of the first automobiles in frontier territories during the 1890s created ripples of excitement and apprehension that extended far beyond their immediate practical utility as transportation devices. These mechanical marvels, with their internal combustion engines and rubber tires, represented the triumph of industrial engineering over the natural limitations that had constrained human mobility for millennia. Yet they also introduced new forms of dependence and vulnerability that would have far-reaching consequences for the communities that embraced them. The roads that had been adequate for horse-drawn vehicles and pedestrian traffic proved woefully inadequate for automobiles, which required smoother surfaces and more gradual grades than their biological predecessors. This necessitated massive investments in infrastructure improvement that strained the resources of frontier communities while creating new forms of economic activity centered around construction and maintenance of transportation networks. The blacksmiths, who had served the needs of horse-drawn transportation, found themselves competing with mechanics who understood the intricacies of internal combustion engines and electrical systems. The social implications of automotive transportation were equally significant, enabling individuals to travel distances that would have required days of preparation and considerable expense using traditional methods. Families could visit relatives in distant towns with unprecedented ease. Young people could seek employment and marriage partners beyond the confines of their immediate communities, and merchants could expand their customer bases across geographical regions that had previously been economically isolated from each other. Yet, this increased mobility came at the cost of traditional forms of community cohesion that had been based partly on geographical necessity and limited transportation options. The bonds that had held frontier settlements together were tested when residents could easily relocate to places that offered better economic opportunities or more attractive social environments. The automobile represented both liberation from geographical constraints and the beginning of community fragmentation that would accelerate throughout the 20th century. The maintenance and operation of automobiles required specialized knowledge and expensive equipment that most frontier communities struggled to provide, creating new forms of dependence on distant manufacturing centers and technical expertise. The gasoline that powered these vehicles had to be transported from refineries hundreds of miles away, while replacement parts and repair services required connections to industrial supply chains that were vulnerable to disruption and manipulation by distant corporate interests. The telegraph lines that had begun connecting frontier communities to the broader American communication network during the 1870s and 80s represented another technological revolution that fundamentally altered the relationship between local and national developments. The ability to transmit information across vast distances in a matter of minutes rather than weeks transformed both commercial activities and social relationships in ways that were not immediately apparent to those who first experienced these capabilities. The commercial advantages of telegraphic communication were obvious and immediate, enabling merchants to coordinate their activities with suppliers and customers across continental distances, while allowing financial institutions to transfer funds and verify creditworthiness with unprecedented speed and reliability. The cattle ranchers who had previously relied on seasonal drives to distant markets could now receive current price information and arrange sales before committing their herds to long and dangerous journeys. Yet the telegraph also introduced new forms of economic vulnerability by connecting local markets to distant financial centers, where decisions made by people with no understanding of local conditions could have devastating consequences for frontier community. The economic panics and stock market fluctuations that originated in New York or Chicago now propagated instantly to the most remote settlements, making local prosperity dependent on events and decisions that were completely beyond local control. The social implications of telegraphic communication were equally profound, enabling families to maintain contact across vast distances, while also making frontier communities aware of national and international developments that had previously seemed as remote as events on other planets. The news that arrived via telegraph often carried information about political decisions, military conflicts, and social movements that challenged local assumptions and created pressures for cultural change that many frontier residents found disturbing. The railroad networks that expanded rapidly across the American continent during this period represented perhaps the most visible and transformative technological development of the entire frontier era. The massive engineering projects required to build transcontinental rail lines, the enormous capital investments necessary to finance such undertakings, and the profound economic and social changes that railroad transportation made possible all testified to the scale and significance of this technological revolution. The construction of railroad lines required the coordination of thousands of workers, massive quantities of materials, and engineering solutions to geographical challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable. The bridges that carried trains across rivers and valleys, the tunnels that penetrated mountain ranges, and the grading operations that created level roadbeds across rolling terrain, all demonstrated human capability to reshape the natural environment on an unprecedented scale. The economic impact of railroad transportation on frontier communities was immediate and dramatic, reducing the cost of moving goods and people across vast distances by orders of magnitude, while making previously isolated regions accessible to national and international markets. Agricultural products that had been consumed locally due to transportation constraints could now be shipped to distant cities, while manufactured goods from industrial centers could be distributed to frontier settlements at prices that local artisans could not match. Yet the railroad also introduced new forms of economic domination that concentrated power in the hands of distant corporate interests, while reducing local autonomy and self-sufficiency. The freight rates charged by railroad companies could determine the economic viability of entire communities, while the scheduling and routing decisions made by railroad executives could direct the flow of commerce and population in ways that benefited some regions at the expense of others. The communities that grew up around railroad stations often developed characteristics that were fundamentally different from those of traditional frontier settlements, being oriented more toward efficient transportation and commerce than toward local resource exploitation or agricultural production. These railroad towns served as conduits between local communities and distant markets rather than as self-sufficient economic units, creating new patterns of settlement and social organization that reflected their specialized functions. The photography that became increasingly accessible to frontier communities during this period represented a technological development whose social and cultural implications were perhaps even more significant than its immediate practical applications. The ability to create permanent visual records of people, places, and events transformed how communities understood their own history and identity, while also changing the relationship between private and public experiences. The portrait studios that established themselves in frontier towns provided services that had previously been available only to the wealthy elite of established cities, enabling ordinary families to create visual records of important life events and family relationships. These photographs served not only as personal mementos, but also as historical documents that preserved information about frontier life that might otherwise have been lost to time and changing circumstances. The landscape photography that documented the American West during this period created visual records of natural environments and human settlements that would prove invaluable to later generations seeking to understand how the frontier had looked before industrial development transformed it beyond recognition. These images served both artistic and documentary functions, inspiring appreciation for natural beauty while also providing evidence of environmental changes that accompanied human settlement and resource exploitation. The social rituals that developed around photography, from the formal poses required for portrait sessions to the careful preservation and display of finished images, reflected changing attitudes toward personal identity and family relationships that were characteristic of the broader cultural transformations occurring throughout American society during this period. The photograph album became a new form of family treasure that preserved memories and relationships across generations, while also serving as evidence of social status and cultural sophistication. The medical advances that became available in frontier communities during the 1890s represented another category of technological progress that had profound implications for both individual lives and community development. The improved surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that frontier physicians began employing during this period dramatically reduced mortality rates while enabling treatment of conditions that had previously been considered hopeless. The establishment of hospitals and medical schools in frontier regions demonstrated that these communities could support the kind of specialized institutions that had previously been available only in major metropolitan centers. The training of local physicians and nurses reduced dependence on medical expertise from distant cities, while also creating new forms of professional authority and social status within frontier communities. Yet the increasing sophistication of medical practice also created new forms of inequality and social stratification based on access to expensive treatments and specialized care. The wealthy could afford the latest medical innovations, while the poor continued to rely on traditional remedies and folk healers, creating disparities in health outcomes that reflected broader patterns of economic inequality within frontier society. The pharmaceutical industry that developed during this period introduced both genuine therapeutic advances and questionable patent medicines that preyed upon the hopes and fears of people facing serious illnesses. The regulation of medical practice and pharmaceutical sales remained inconsistent and often ineffective, allowing charlatans and incompetent practitioners to exploit vulnerable populations, while also enabling legitimate innovations to reach communities that desperately needed them. The contrast between old ways and new inventions became increasingly apparent in every aspect of frontier life, as traditional methods of production, communication, and transportation found themselves in competition with technological alternatives that offered greater efficiency but required substantial investments and specialized knowledge. The craftsmen who had served frontier communities with hand tools and traditional techniques found their livelihoods threatened by manufactured goods that were produced more cheaply and consistently using industrial methods. The mills that had ground grain using water power were replaced by steam-powered facilities that could operate continuously, regardless of seasonal variations in water flow, while the local blacksmiths who had fabricated tools and hardware according to individual specifications found themselves competing with mass-produced items that were cheaper but less precisely suited to local needs and preferences. The hunting and trapping that had provided both subsistence and cash income for many frontier families became less economically viable as overhunting reduced game populations, while manufactured clothing and synthetic materials replaced furs and hides in many traditional applications. The skills and knowledge that had enabled survival and prosperity in the early frontier period became less relevant as technological alternatives became available and economic opportunities shifted toward activities that required different capabilities. The educational systems that frontier communities established during this period reflected the tension between traditional forms of learning based on practical experience and direct instruction versus more formal educational approaches that emphasized abstract knowledge and preparation for participation in industrial society. The one-room schoolhouses that served many frontier settlements provided basic literacy and numerical skills, while also serving as community centers where social bonds were formed and cultural values were transmitted across generations. Yet the curriculum that these schools provided was often inadequate preparation for the technological and economic realities that young people would face as adults in an increasingly industrialized society. The classical education that emphasized Latin, rhetoric, and moral philosophy that characterized many educational programs was poorly suited to the practical needs of students who would work in factories, operate complex machinery, or manage modern business enterprises. The vocational training that some forward-thinking communities began to provide recognized that technological progress required new forms of specialized knowledge and practical skills that traditional educational approaches could not supply effectively. The trade schools and technical institutes that emerged during this period represented attempts to bridge the gap between traditional craftsmanship and modern industrial production, while also creating pathways for individual advancement within the changing economic landscape. The libraries and literary societies that flourished in many frontier communities during this period demonstrated that technological progress could enhance rather than replace traditional forms of cultural and intellectual development. The improved transportation and communication that technology made possible enabled frontier communities to participate in national, intellectual, and cultural movements, while also preserving and developing their own distinct regional characteristics and traditions. The impact of technology on frontier communities was neither uniformly positive nor entirely negative, but rather represented a complex mixture of opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation and adaptive responses from individuals and communities alike. The technologies that offered genuine improvements in living standards and economic opportunities were often accompanied by new forms of dependence and vulnerability that had to be managed carefully to avoid unintended consequences. The communities that most successfully adapted to technological change were those that managed to selectively adopt innovations that served their genuine needs while maintaining enough independence and traditional capabilities to avoid complete dependence on distant suppliers and technical experts. This required both wisdom in choosing which technologies to embrace and courage in resisting those that offered short-term advantages at the cost of long-term autonomy and sustainability. As the 19th century drew to its close, and the American frontier began its transformation into something more closely resembling the industrial society that characterized other regions of the country, the relationship between technological progress and human welfare became increasingly complex and ambiguous. The machines and systems that promised to liberate people from traditional constraints often created new forms of limitation and control that were less visible but no less significant than those they replaced. The legacy of this technological transformation extends far beyond its immediate historical context to encompass ongoing questions about the relationship between human needs and technological capabilities that continue to challenge contemporary society. The frontier experience with rapid technological change provides both inspiration and cautionary tales for subsequent generations facing their own challenges in adapting to innovations that promise both benefits and risks that are difficult to assess accurately before their full implications become apparent. The moral landscape of the American frontier was neither the simple tableau of good versus evil that popular mythology would later paint, nor the complete absence of ethical guidance that critics of frontier society often claimed to observe. Instead, it was a complex terrain where traditional moral frameworks struggled to maintain relevance under conditions that their original architects had never imagined, while new forms of ethical reasoning emerged organically from the practical necessities of survival and community building in an environment that demanded constant adaptation and innovation. Arthur Morgan's journey toward redemption represents perhaps the most compelling example of how the frontier could transform even the most hardened individuals through a combination of physical suffering, moral awakening, and the gradual recognition that individual actions carried consequences that extended far beyond their immediate participants. The tuberculosis that slowly consumed his body served as both punishment for past transgressions and catalyst for the kind of deep self-examination that prosperity and health might never have encouraged. The disease that Arthur contracted through his participation in the gang's debt collection activities provided a stark reminder that violence, however justified through elaborate philosophical frameworks, inevitably extracted costs from both its perpetrators and its victims. The coughing fits that punctuated his daily activities, the gradual weakening of his physical capabilities, and the growing awareness of his own mortality all contributed to a process of moral awakening that transformed his understanding of what constituted meaningful existence. Arthur's interactions with the Downs family, whose patriarch's death from tuberculosis he had hastened through his aggressive collection methods, forced him to confront the human cost of criminal activities that he had previously been able to rationalize as necessary components of the gang's survival strategy. The widow's grief, the son's anger, and the daughter's fear all served as mirrors that reflected the moral reality of actions he had performed without adequate consideration of their broader implications. The journal entries that Arthur wrote during his final months reveal a man struggling to reconcile a lifetime of violence and criminal behavior with a growing recognition that genuine honor required more than simple loyalty to one's immediate companions. His sketches of landscapes and wildlife, interspersed with increasingly introspective observations about the nature of right and wrong, demonstrate how physical illness could paradoxically lead to spiritual and moral clarity that had been absent during years of apparent health and vigor. The assistance that Arthur provided to individuals and families facing various forms of hardship during his final period represented a conscious attempt to balance the scales of moral accounting that had been accumulating throughout his adult life, his donations to the Downs family, his efforts to help other victims of the gang's activities, and his protection of those who were vulnerable to exploitation by others, all demonstrated that redemption was possible, even for someone who had spent decades participating in activities that caused genuine harm to innocent people. Yet Arthur's redemption was neither complete nor unambiguous, reflecting the complex moral realities that characterized frontier life more generally. His final acts of heroism and self-sacrifice, while admirable and morally significant, could not entirely erase the consequences of his earlier choices or restore to full health the communities and individuals that had been damaged by his previous activities. The tuberculosis that claimed his life served as a reminder that moral awakening, however genuine and profound, could not always prevent the physical consequences of past actions from reaching their inevitable conclusion. The concept of honor that operated within frontier society was fundamentally different from the more formalized codes of conduct that characterized established civilizations, with their elaborate legal systems and social hierarchies. Frontier honor was practical and immediate, based more on reliable behavior and consistent character than on adherence to abstract principles that might have little relevance to the daily challenges of survival in harsh and unpredictable circumstances. The honor that frontier communities recognized and respected was demonstrated through actions rather than declared through words, earned through consistent behavior over time rather than inherited through family connections or achieved through single dramatic gestures. A person's reputation for reliability, honesty, and courage was built through countless small interactions and tested through various forms of adversity that revealed character more clearly than any formal declaration of principles or intentions could accomplish. The saloons and trading posts where frontier men and women gathered to conduct business and socialize served as informal courtrooms where reputations were established, maintained, or destroyed through the accumulated testimony of those who had direct experience with particular individuals. The stories that were told and retold in these venues served not merely as entertainment but as a form of community memory that preserved information about character and behavior that was essential for making informed decisions about trust, cooperation, and mutual support. The flexibility that characterized frontier concepts of honor reflected the practical recognition that survival in challenging circumstances sometimes required actions that would be considered inappropriate or even immoral under more comfortable conditions. The theft of food by someone facing starvation, the use of violence in defense of family or community, and the violation of property rights when dealing with those who had forfeited their own claims to moral consideration were all potentially justifiable under frontier conditions, despite their obvious conflicts with conventional moral teaching. Yet this flexibility was not unlimited, and frontier communities maintained clear distinctions between actions that were morally acceptable under extreme circumstances and those that were simply criminal, regardless of their justification. The man who stole food to feed his starving children might earn sympathy and even admiration, while the man who stole for personal enrichment or convenience would face community censure and potential retaliation from his victims. John Marston's ultimate sacrifice for his family represented the culmination of a long process of moral development that had been shaped by his experiences as both criminal and family man, outlaw and aspiring citizen, violent individual, and loving father. His decision to face certain death rather than abandon his wife and son to the consequences of his past criminal activities demonstrated that even someone with a history of selfish and destructive behavior could eventually develop the kind of moral courage that frontier society most deeply respected and admired. The government agents who hunted John understood that his past criminal activities had made him a legitimate target for law enforcement action, yet their methods and motivations revealed their own moral limitations and the corrupting influence of institutional power when exercised without adequate accountability or restraint. The manipulation of John's family relationships, the threats against innocent people, and the ultimate betrayal of agreements that had been negotiated in good faith, all demonstrated that legal authority did not automatically confer moral legitimacy. The tragedy of John's story lay not simply in his death, but in the recognition that his transformation from outlaw to family man had come too late to prevent the consequences of his earlier choices from destroying the peaceful life he had tried to create, the ranch that he had built with his own hands, the relationships he had cultivated with his neighbors, and the dreams he had harbored for his son's future were all swept away by forces that had been set in motion years before his moral awakening had occurred. Yet John's sacrifice was not meaningless, for it demonstrated both to his family and to the broader community that genuine redemption was possible, even under the most challenging circumstances, that individuals could choose to act according to moral principles, even when such choices carried the ultimate personal cost. His death served as both tragedy and inspiration, illustrating both the limits and the possibilities of individual moral agency within larger historical and social forces that individuals could influence but not fully control. The corrupting influence of revenge that poisoned so many frontier relationships represented one of the most persistent moral challenges that individuals and communities faced, in an environment where formal legal institutions were often absent or ineffective. The cycle of violence that began with legitimate grievances and escalated through successive acts of retaliation created patterns of behavior that could persist across generations while causing enormous suffering to both perpetrators and innocent bystanders who became inadvertently involved in conflicts that had origins they neither understood nor contributed to. The feuds that characterized relationships between families like the Braithwaites and the Greys demonstrated how initial conflicts over resources, political power, or social status could metastasize into comprehensive systems of mutual hatred that eventually consumed rational decision-making and community harmony. The original causes of these conflicts, whatever their legitimacy, became less important than the accumulated grievances and desire for retaliation that motivated continued violence long after any possibility of rational resolution had disappeared. The children who grew up within these feuding families inherited not only material resources and social connections, but also moral obligations to continue conflicts that predated their birth and would likely outlast their deaths. The psychological burden of carrying forward ancestral grudges while also trying to build meaningful individual lives created internal tensions that few individuals were able to resolve satisfactorily, leading to cycles of guilt, anger, and confused loyalty that perpetuated destructive patterns across multiple generations. The economic costs of these feuds extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire regional economies that were distorted by the need to accommodate ongoing violence and instability. The business relationships, political alliances, and social institutions that might have contributed to general prosperity were all compromised by the necessity of choosing sides in conflicts that offered no clear moral guidance and no obvious path toward resolution that would satisfy all legitimate interests. Yet frontier society also demonstrated remarkable capacity for small acts of kindness and mutual support that provided counterbalances to the violence and selfishness that received more attention from contemporary observers and later historians, the neighbors who helped during medical emergencies, the strangers who shared food and shelter during harsh weather, and the informal networks of mutual assistance that developed within frontier communities, all testified to human capacity for generosity and cooperation, even under challenging circumstances. The women who cared for sick children regardless of family feuds or political differences. The men who risked their own safety to rescue others from natural disasters or criminal violence. And the communities that rallied to support families facing economic hardship, all demonstrated that moral behavior was not simply a luxury that could be afforded only during periods of prosperity and security. Rather, it was often during the most difficult times that individual character was most clearly revealed, and community bonds were either strengthened or shattered, depending on how people chose to respond to shared challenges. The informal charitable activities that characterized many frontier communities operated according to principles of reciprocity and mutual obligation that created social safety nets more flexible and responsive than the formal welfare institutions that would later develop in more organized societies. These systems depended on shared understanding that individual prosperity was ultimately dependent on community welfare, that helping others during their time of need created obligations that would be honored when circumstances reversed and assistance flowed in the opposite direction. The role of faith and spirituality in frontier moral life was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the diverse religious backgrounds and personal experiences that characterized frontier populations. The churches that established themselves in frontier communities provided not only spiritual guidance, but also social organization and community identity that helped bind diverse populations together, while also creating their own forms of division and conflict based on doctrinal differences and competing claims to moral authority. The circuit riders and traveling preachers who served scattered frontier settlements often found themselves adapting traditional religious teachings to circumstances that their theological training had not anticipated, developing practical approaches to moral guidance that balanced scriptural authority with recognition of the unique challenges that frontier conditions presented to those seeking to live according to Christian principles. The camp meetings and revival gatherings that periodically swept through frontier regions provided opportunities for spiritual renewal and community celebration that served important psychological and social functions beyond their explicitly religious purposes. These events allowed isolated individuals and families to reconnect with broader communities of faith, while also providing forums for addressing moral questions and social problems that might otherwise have remained unresolved. Yet religious authority was often contested in frontier communities, where established denominational hierarchies carried less weight than personal charisma and practical wisdom in determining whose spiritual guidance would be accepted and followed. The competition between different religious traditions, combined with the practical challenges of maintaining organized congregations in sparsely populated areas, created opportunities for both genuine spiritual innovation and harmful religious charlatanism. The individual choices that ultimately determined how frontier moral challenges were resolved reflected the complex interaction between personal character, social pressures, and immediate circumstances that shaped decision-making processes in ways that were often invisible to outside observers. The moment-by-moment decisions about whether to help or ignore someone in distress, whether to tell the truth or construct convenient falsehoods, and whether to fulfill obligations or pursue immediate self-interest, all contributed to the moral fabric of frontier communities in ways that were both individually significant and collectively determinative. The accumulated weight of these individual moral choices created community cultures that either supported or undermined the kinds of behavior that contributed to general welfare and individual flourishing. Communities that consistently rewarded honesty, generosity, and courage while discouraging selfishness, cruelty, and cowardice created social environments that encouraged moral development and mutual support. Those that failed to maintain such standards found themselves trapped in cycles of mistrust and conflict that made cooperative problem-solving increasingly difficult. The moral legacy of frontier society extends far beyond its immediate historical context to encompass ongoing questions about individual responsibility, community obligation, and the relationship between personal freedom and social welfare that continue to challenge contemporary societies. The frontier experience demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of moral behavior under conditions of limited institutional authority and maximum individual autonomy, providing both inspiration and cautionary tales for subsequent generations facing their own ethical dilemmas. The stories of redemption and sacrifice, honor and corruption, kindness and cruelty that emerged from frontier life illustrate the fundamental human capacity for moral growth and development, even under the most challenging circumstances. They remind us that ethical behavior is not simply a matter of following established rules or conforming to social expectations, but rather requires ongoing personal reflection, practical wisdom, and the courage to act according to moral principles, even when such actions carry significant personal costs. In the choices made by individuals like Arthur Morgan and John Marston, we find both models for moral behavior and recognition of the complex circumstances that make such behavior both difficult and necessary for the creation of communities worthy of human loyalty and love. Jack Marston's inheritance was not the kind that most young men of his generation could have anticipated or desired, consisting, as it did not of material wealth or social position, but of a legacy written in violence and sealed with sacrifice that would shape his understanding of the world in ways both profound and troubling. When he stood over his father's grave in that quiet cemetery outside Blackwater in 1911, he was not merely mourning the loss of a parent, but confronting the weight of a family history that had been purchased with blood and maintained through decades of choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but whose consequences would reverberate through his own life in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The transformation that had overtaken the American West during the years between John Marston's death and Jack's emergence into adulthood was so complete and fundamental that it seemed to represent not merely the passage of time, but the transition between entirely different civilizations. The frontier that had shaped his father's character and determined his destiny had been replaced by something that bore only superficial resemblance to the wild and dangerous landscape where the Van der Linde gang had once roamed freely, pursuing their vision of liberty through criminal enterprise. The Blackwater that Jack encountered when he finally tracked down Edgar Ross was no longer the rough frontier town where his father's gang had attempted their final, disastrous score in 1899. The muddy streets had been paved with concrete and lined with electric streetlights. The simple wooden buildings had been replaced by substantial brick structures that housed modern businesses, offering goods and services that would have been unimaginable just 15 years earlier. The population had swelled from a few hundred hardy pioneers to several thousand citizens representing every social class and ethnic background that characterized American society in the early 20th century. The automobiles that crowded these paved streets, their internal combustion engines producing a constant rumble that had replaced the clip-clop of horse hooves as the dominant sound of urban transportation, represented more than simple technological advancement. They embodied a fundamental shift in the relationship between human beings, and the distances that had once seemed so vast and intimidating that they could only be crossed through careful planning and considerable personal risk. The journey that had once required days of dangerous travel through hostile territory could now be completed in hours of comfortable riding along well-maintained roads protected by regular police patrols. The railroad networks that connected Blackwater to every major city in North America had transformed the town from an isolated frontier outpost into a minor hub of continental commerce, where goods manufactured in Detroit or Chicago could be purchased as easily as items produced by local artisans. The telegraph and telephone systems that linked every business and many private residences to communication networks spanning the entire continent meant that local events were no longer confined to local consequences, that decisions made in distant boardrooms could have immediate impact on the daily lives of people who had never traveled beyond their home counties. The federal law enforcement agencies that had been little more than distant rumors during the frontier era now maintained permanent offices staffed by professional investigators whose training and resources far exceeded anything that local sheriffs or territorial marshals could have imagined. The Pinkertons, who had once pursued the Van der Linde gang through trackless wilderness, now worked alongside federal marshals, postal inspectors, and other specialized agents who could coordinate their activities across state lines and draw upon scientific techniques for criminal investigation that made traditional methods of evasion increasingly obsolete. The banking and financial institutions that had emerged to serve this more complex and interconnected economy operated according to principles that would have been completely foreign to the simple cash and barter transactions that had characterized frontier commerce. The credit systems, investment opportunities, and insurance products that these institutions offered created new forms of economic relationship that bound individuals and communities into networks of mutual dependence that extended far beyond their immediate geographical boundaries. Jack's own transformation from the bookish child who had dreamed of becoming a writer into the grim young man who methodically hunted down and killed Edgar Ross reflected not only personal tragedy but the broader cultural shift that had occurred as America's frontier era drew to its inevitable close. The literature that had once captured his imagination, the stories of adventure and moral clarity that had seemed to offer models for meaningful existence, no longer provided adequate guidance for navigating a world where traditional categories of right and wrong had been complicated by institutional complexities and moral ambiguities that frontier society had never been forced to address. The education that Jack had received, partly through formal schooling and partly through his own extensive reading, had prepared him for participation in a society that valued intellectual achievement and cultural refinement over the physical courage and practical skills that had been essential for frontier survival. Yet the circumstances of his family history made it impossible for him to simply step into the role of educated professional that his abilities and interests might have suggested, trapping him between two worlds in ways that made genuine belonging to either one impossible. The legal system that might have provided Jack with legitimate recourse for his grievances against those responsible for his father's death was the same system that had classified John Marston as a criminal whose elimination was not only justified but necessary for the maintenance of social order. The courts that now functioned with increasing efficiency and formal procedure throughout the former frontier territories offered no avenue for challenging the fundamental legitimacy of government actions that had been undertaken according to established legal procedures, regardless of their moral questionability or their impact on innocent family members. The newspapers and magazines that Jack might have read while developing his understanding of contemporary events reflected perspectives and priorities that bore little relationship to the experiences of families like his own. focusing instead on political developments, economic trends, and cultural movements that seemed to emerge from and serve the interests of social classes that had little direct connection to frontier history or rural life. The stories that were told about the passing of the frontier era emphasized progress, modernization, and the triumph of civilization over chaos, while largely ignoring the human costs that such transformation had exacted from those who had been displaced or marginalized by the process. The fate of former gang members like Charles Smith and Sadie Adler illustrated different possible responses to the challenge of adapting frontier experiences to modern circumstances. Yet neither of their paths offered models that Jack could easily follow, given his particular combination of family history, personal temperament, and social position. Charles had managed to find peace through integration with indigenous communities that maintained some connection to pre-modern ways of life, while Sadie had channeled her capacity for violence into the socially acceptable profession of bounty hunting. Both had found ways to preserve essential aspects of their frontier identities while adapting to changed circumstances, yet both had also paid personal costs that reflected the difficulty of such transitions. The industrial economy that was rapidly replacing the extractive and agricultural activities that had sustained frontier communities operated according to principles of efficiency, standardization, and mass production that left little room for the kind of individual initiative and personal craftsmanship that had characterized the best aspects of frontier economic life. The factories that now employed thousands of workers in cities like Saint Denis and Blackwater offered steady wages and relative security in exchange for acceptance of working conditions that reduced human beings to interchangeable components in mechanical systems designed to maximize productivity rather than personal satisfaction or community welfare. The labor unions that had begun organizing these industrial workers represented attempts to restore some measure of human agency and dignity to economic relationships that seemed designed to eliminate both. Yet their methods and goals reflected the same institutional thinking that characterized other aspects of modern society. The collective bargaining, political lobbying, and bureaucratic organization that unions employed to advance worker interests bore little resemblance to the direct action and personal relationships that had enabled frontier communities to address their problems and resolve their conflicts. The cultural institutions that flourished in modernizing communities offered unprecedented opportunities for artistic expression, intellectual development, and social interaction. Yet they also reflected values and priorities that often seemed disconnected from the experiences and needs of people whose lives had been shaped by frontier conditions. The theaters, museums, and libraries that represented the flowering of civilized culture celebrated forms of achievement and beauty that, however admirable in themselves, provided little guidance for individuals struggling to find meaning and purpose in a world that seemed to have moved beyond their understanding. The women's suffrage movement that was gaining momentum throughout American society during these years represented another aspect of social change that had complex implications for people whose understanding of gender roles had been shaped by frontier conditions. The traditional division of labor and social responsibilities that had characterized frontier families was being challenged by urban women whose economic independence and political activism suggested possibilities for female participation in public life that frontier society had rarely recognized or encouraged. Yet the feminist rhetoric that emerged from urban reform movements often failed to acknowledge the ways in which frontier women had already achieved forms of practical equality and personal agency that their city counterparts were still fighting to establish. Women like Sadie Adler and Abigail Marston had demonstrated courage, competence, and leadership under conditions that tested their capabilities in ways that few urban women would ever encounter. Yet their achievements were not recognized or celebrated by reform movements that focused primarily on legal and political equality, rather than practical capability and personal autonomy. The environmental consequences of rapid industrialization and urban development were becoming increasingly apparent throughout the former frontier territories as forests were clear-cut to provide lumber for construction projects. Rivers were polluted by industrial waste and urban sewage, and wildlife populations were decimated by commercial hunting and habitat destruction. The landscape that had once seemed inexhaustibly vast and endlessly renewable was revealing itself to be finite and vulnerable in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human society and natural systems. The conservation movement that emerged in response to these environmental concerns represented an attempt to preserve remnants of wilderness and wildlife for future generations. Yet its approaches and priorities often reflected urban perspectives and elite interests that had little connection to the experiences of people who had lived and worked in these environments when they were still relatively intact. The national parks and forest reserves that were being established during this period served important conservation purposes, while also restricting access and traditional uses by indigenous peoples and rural communities whose relationships with these lands predated the conservation movement by centuries. The political processes that were reshaping American society during the early 20th century operated according to democratic principles that theoretically provided opportunities for all citizens to participate in governance. Yet the reality of political power increasingly favored organized interest groups, professional politicians, and wealthy individuals whose resources enabled them to influence policy decisions in ways that ordinary citizens could rarely match. The populist movements that claimed to represent rural and working-class interests often proved vulnerable to manipulation by demagogues whose ultimate goals served their own advancement rather than the welfare of their supposed constituents. The technological innovations that continued to transform daily life throughout American society offered unprecedented conveniences and capabilities, while also creating new forms of dependence and vulnerability that were not immediately apparent to those who embraced them enthusiastically. The electrical power systems, telephone networks, and transportation infrastructure that made modern urban life possible also made communities dependent on complex technical systems that could be disrupted by accidents, sabotage, or simple mechanical failure in ways that could paralyze entire regions and leave their inhabitants helpless without the traditional skills and resources that had enabled frontier communities to maintain their independence. The cultural memory of frontier experiences was already being transformed into romanticized mythology that emphasized adventure, individualism, and moral clarity, while downplaying the violence, hardship, and moral ambiguity that had characterized actual frontier life. The dime novels, Wild West shows, and early motion pictures that were beginning to shape popular understanding of frontier history created simplified narratives that served the entertainment needs of urban audiences, while providing little accurate information about the complex realities that had shaped the lives of people like the Marston family. As Jack Marston stood at the threshold of adulthood in this transformed America, he faced choices that his father's generation had never been forced to confront. Decisions about how to live meaningfully in a society that seemed to offer unprecedented opportunities, while also imposing constraints that were more subtle but no less limiting than the harsh conditions that had shaped frontier life. The education and cultural background that distinguished him from his outlaw heritage also isolated him from communities and activities that might have provided the sense of purpose and belonging that every human being requires for psychological health, and personal fulfillment. The revenge that Jack ultimately chose to pursue against Edgar Ross represented not only personal justice for his father's death, but also a symbolic rejection of the legal and social systems that had transformed America from a frontier society into something more organized but not necessarily more just or humane. His decision to kill the retired federal agent who had orchestrated John Marston's death demonstrated that the old code of personal honor and direct action had not been entirely eliminated by the advance of civilization, yet it also ensured that Jack would remain forever outside the boundaries of respectable society, regardless of his other qualities or achievements. The cycle of violence that had begun with Dutch van der Linde's idealistic rebellion against industrial capitalism and continued through John Marston's attempt to escape his criminal past, finally reached its conclusion with Jack's act of personal vengeance. Yet the broader forces that had created these individual tragedies continued to operate throughout American society. The concentration of economic power, the growth of government authority, and the transformation of independent communities into dependent components of larger systems all continued to generate the kinds of conflicts and injustices that had originally motivated Dutch's gang to choose criminal resistance over legal submission. The death of the frontier era represented more than the end of a particular historical period, encompassing also the closing of possibilities for individual and community autonomy that would not be available to subsequent generations of Americans. The vast spaces that had once offered refuge for those who could not or would not conform to established social patterns were being organized, regulated, and incorporated into systems that left little room for genuine alternatives to mainstream American life. The frontier had offered both opportunities and dangers, both freedom and hardship, yet it had provided space for human experiences and achievements that would become increasingly difficult to replicate as American society became more thoroughly organized and controlled. In the transformation of places like Blackwater from frontier outposts into modern cities, we can observe both the remarkable achievements and the significant losses that accompanied America's transition from frontier society to industrial civilization. The material prosperity, technological sophistication, and cultural opportunities that characterized modern urban life represented genuine improvements in living standards for many people. Yet these advances came at the cost of forms of independence, community, solidarity, and personal agency that had been essential characteristics of the frontier experience at its best. And so our journey through these legendary lands comes to its gentle close, like the last light of sunset fading behind distant mountains. We have witnessed the rise and fall of outlaws, the triumph and tragedy of those who sought freedom in an untamed world, and the inevitable march of progress that transformed wilderness into civilization. The stories we've shared tonight are more than mere tales of adventure. They are echoes of the human spirit's eternal struggle between freedom and responsibility, between the wild heart and the civilized mind. The frontier that shaped the lives of Red Harlow and Dutch van der Linde, Arthur Morgan and John Marston, was never simply a place but rather a state of possibility, a condition of existence where individuals could remake themselves according to their own vision of what life should be rather than accepting the limitations that established society imposed upon those born into particular circumstances. This was both the promise and the peril of frontier life, its greatest gift and its most dangerous temptation. The legends that emerged from this vast experiment in human freedom were simultaneously true and false, accurate in their recognition of genuine heroism and authentic achievement, while also simplified in their portrayal of complex moral realities that defied easy categorization. The men and women who became legendary figures were neither the pure heroes that popular culture would later celebrate, nor the simple criminals that legal authorities often portrayed them to be, but rather human beings struggling to find meaning and purpose under conditions that tested every assumption about right and wrong, justice and necessity, individual liberty and social responsibility. Red Harlow's transformation from historical figure to mythological archetype demonstrated how frontier society created its own forms of meaning through storytelling traditions that preserved essential truths while adapting them to serve the psychological needs of communities that required both inspiration and guidance. The stories that were told around campfires and in saloons served functions that went far beyond mere entertainment, providing frameworks for understanding moral behavior and models for individual development that formal institutions could not always supply. The Van der Linde gang's golden years and ultimate dissolution illustrated how even the most idealistic visions of alternative social organization could be corrupted by the very conditions they sought to escape, how the violence that seemed necessary for survival outside legal frameworks could eventually destroy the bonds of trust and mutual support that made such communities possible in the first place. Dutch's philosophy of freedom through criminal enterprise contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, yet it also provided genuine experiences of brotherhood and purpose that its members would remember with longing long after the gang had scattered to the winds. Arthur Morgan's journey toward redemption revealed how physical suffering could become spiritual awakening, how confrontation with mortality could clarify moral vision in ways that health and prosperity rarely achieved. His transformation from unquestioning loyalty to Dutch's leadership into independent moral judgment demonstrated that personal growth remained possible even for those who had spent decades participating in activities that caused genuine harm to others. Yet his story also illustrated the tragic reality that such growth often came too late to prevent the consequences of earlier choices from reaching their inevitable conclusion. John Marston's sacrifice for his family represented the ultimate expression of frontier honor, the willingness to face certain death rather than abandon those who depended upon him for protection and support. His decision to confront government agents, despite knowing that such confrontation would end in his death, demonstrated that some values transcended calculations of self-interest, that authentic love and loyalty could motivate behavior that rational analysis would never recommend. The legendary gunslingers who moved through this world like figures from ancient mythology embodied both the possibilities and limitations of individual agency under frontier conditions. Black Bell's defiance of gender conventions, Billy Midnight's destruction through alcohol and trauma, Emmett Granger's transformation from killer to entrepreneur, and Flaco Hernandez's reign over the borderlands all illustrated different ways that exceptional individuals could carve out spaces for themselves within a social order that was still fluid enough to accommodate innovation and domo, personal reinvention. The mysteries that emerged from frontier landscapes, from the strange man's omniscient observations to the UFO sightings that challenged assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos, reflected the way that vast and sparsely populated territories could preserve spaces for experiences that more densely settled regions would have rationalized away through systematic observation and scientific analysis. These mysteries served important psychological functions, reminding frontier communities that their understanding of the world remained incomplete and that room existed for wonder, fear, and spiritual speculation. The communities that flourished throughout the frontier territories demonstrated remarkable creativity in developing forms of social organization that could accommodate diversity while maintaining enough cohesion to ensure survival under challenging circumstances. St. Denis, with its cosmopolitan sophistication, Valentine with its rough camaraderie, Strawberry with its careful respectability, and the various indigenous and immigrant communities that maintained their distinctive cultural traditions while adapting to American conditions, all provided evidence that human societies could adapt to almost any environment when necessity demanded such adaptation. The technological transformation that swept through frontier society during the final decades of the 19th century represented both liberation from traditional constraints and the creation of new forms of dependence that were less visible but no less limiting than those they replaced. The automobiles, telegraph lines, railroads, and other innovations that connected frontier communities to broader networks of communication and commerce also made them vulnerable to decisions and events that were completely beyond local control, transforming independent settlements into dependent components of larger economic and political systems. The moral landscape of frontier society proved to be neither the simple tableau of good versus evil that popular culture would later portray, nor the complete absence of ethical guidance that critics often claim to observe. Instead, it was a complex terrain where traditional moral frameworks struggled to maintain relevance under unprecedented conditions, while new forms of ethical reasoning emerged from practical experience and community necessity. The honor that frontier society recognized and rewarded was demonstrated through actions rather than declared through words, earned through consistent behavior over time rather than inherited through social position. The dying of the frontier era represented more than the end of a particular historical period, encompassing also the closing of possibilities for individual and community autonomy that would not be available to subsequent generations. The vast spaces that had once offered refuge for those who could not or would not conform to established social patterns were being organized, regulated, and incorporated into systems that left little room for genuine alternatives to mainstream American life. Jack Marston's inheritance of his father's legacy and his ultimate decision to pursue personal vengeance against those responsible for John's death symbolized both the persistence and the futility of frontier values in a world that had moved beyond their relevance. His education and cultural sophistication prepared him for participation in modern American society, yet his family history made such participation impossible, trapping him between two worlds in ways that made genuine belonging to either one unattainable. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself imagine not the violence we've witnessed, but the quiet moments. Campfires under starlit skies, the gentle sound of horses grazing in moonlit meadows, and the enduring hope that somewhere, in some hidden valley, the frontier spirit lives on. Rest now in the knowledge that legends never truly die. They simply wait in the spaces between sleeping and waking, ready to ride again whenever we need them most. The stories we've shared tonight will continue their journey through the realm of dreams, carrying with them all the courage and tragedy, the hope and loss that defined an era when America was still becoming itself, still discovering what it meant to be free in an untamed world. Sweet dreams, partner, and may your rest be as peaceful as those distant campfires where friendship was forged in hardship and honor, was measured not in gold but in the steadfast loyalty of those who chose to ride together through whatever storms the world might bring.